My brother was taking his final breaths in a sterile hospice bed. Across the hall, a frail old woman sat entirely alone with no visitors. I brought her a simple blueberry muffin and we shared a quiet conversation. The night before my nephew was supposed to arrive, that frail woman grabbed my arm with terrifying strength. She whispered a warning that froze the blood in my veins. "Drive home tonight if you want to save what is yours." I am Ruben. I am 70 years old and I spent 4 decades building a logistics empire from the ground up. I am an African-American man who speaks softly but observes everything. I learned early on that true power does not shout. True power listens. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. If you have ever felt the sting of betrayal from your own flesh and blood, you will understand exactly why I did what I had to do. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound left in my brother Simon's room. Simon lay motionless under the thin hospital blanket. He was in a deep coma. His chest rose and fell with the mechanical assistance of a ventilator. I sat beside him on an unforgiving plastic chair. I watched the man who had been my partner, my anchor, and my best friend slip away. We had hauled freight across the country for 40 years. 40 years of shifting gears in the dead of night. 40 years of gripping steering wheels until our knuckles ached. We built a national freight company from a single rusted truck. We built an empire from diesel fumes and worn tires. Now all that monumental strength was reduced to a quiet room smelling of antiseptic and impending loss. Derek was Simon's only son. Derek and his white wife Nicole had called me earlier that afternoon. Derek claimed they were boarding a flight the next morning to say their final goodbyes. He sounded devastated on the phone. He sounded like a son rushing to be by his father's side. I believed him. I told him to travel safely and that I would stay with Simon through the long, dark night. I prepared to sleep in that uncomfortable chair. Across the hall from Simon's room was an elderly patient named Mrs. Gable. She was a quiet woman. She never had any visitors. No family came to hold her hand. I felt a deep ache seeing her absolute isolation. I walked down to the hospital cafeteria and bought a blueberry muffin. I brought it to her room and sat by her bed. We talked about simple things. I told her about the long highways. Mrs. Gable listened with a gentle smile. She ate the muffin slowly. She thanked me for the company. She said a warm conversation was a rare luxury in a place waiting for death. I stood up to return to my brother. I reached out to adjust her blanket. Mrs. Gable suddenly grabbed my wrist. Her grip was startlingly firm. Her gentle demeanor vanished entirely. Her eyes locked onto mine with a sharp and terrifying intensity. She pulled me closer to her face. I could feel her breath against my ear. "Listen to me, Ruben," she whispered in a hurried, frantic tone. "Drive home tonight if you can." I stared at her in confusion. I asked her what she meant. I told her I needed to stay with Simon. I told her my brother was failing fast. Mrs. Gable did not let go of my wrist. Her grip tightened even more. "I suffer from terrible insomnia, Ruben. I cannot sleep. I walk the halls at night when everyone else is dreaming. 10 minutes ago I was near the nurse's station. The night nurse was on the phone. She was speaking in a rushed and secretive voice. She thought no one was listening. She thought she was entirely alone. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I asked Mrs. Gable what the nurse had said. Mrs. Gable leaned closer. She said the nurse was talking to a woman named Nicole. She said the nurse accepted a massive cash bribe. The nurse agreed to leave Simon's bedside unmonitored tonight. The nurse promised she would not check his vitals for the next 4 hours. They are paying her to look the other way, Ruben. They are paying her to let your brother die alone in the dark. They are paying for his silent end. The name Nicole hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Nicole was Derek's entitled wife. Nicole was the woman who complained about the smell of our work boots. If Nicole was transferring bribes to a hospice nurse tonight, she was not waiting for a flight tomorrow morning. Derek and Nicole did not delay their trip. They were already in the city. They were already executing a vicious plan. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind. Derek's devastated phone call was a calculated distraction. It was a lie designed to keep me away from the estate. If they wanted Simon dead tonight, they needed me trapped here watching him fade. They needed the house empty. They needed clear access to the heart of the empire. I looked down at Mrs. Gable. I saw genuine fear in her eyes. I saw the absolute unvarnished truth. I thanked her. I thanked her for paying attention when the world ignored her. I told her I would never forget this kindness. I walked back into Simon's room. I looked at his frail body. I looked at the monitors. The betrayal burned inside me like a furnace. My own nephew was orchestrating a murder by neglect. The fire in my chest was blinding. I knew I could not cause a scene in the hospital. I could not confront the corrupt nurse without concrete proof. I had to secure the source of their desperation. They wanted the house empty for a specific reason. They were after the documents. They were after the foundation of the empire Simon and I had built from nothing. I leaned down and kissed my brother's forehead. I promised him I would protect his legacy. I promised him I would stop the vipers he had welcomed into his home. I walked out of the room. I walked past the night nurse sitting at the main desk. She looked up at me with feigned innocence. I told her I needed to get some fresh air. I told her I would be back shortly. I stepped out into the freezing night air. The parking lot was desolate. I walked to my truck. I climbed inside and gripped the steering wheel. My hands were shaking not from the cold, but from the massive adrenaline surging through my veins. 40 years. My brother lay dying and his own blood was plotting his erasure. I started the engine. The roar of the diesel motor was a comforting, familiar sound. It was the sound of impending action. It was the sound of a coming reckoning. I pulled out of the hospice parking lot and turned toward the main estate. The drive usually took 30 minutes. I made it in 20. I navigated the dark roads with absolute precision. I did not turn on my headlights as I approached the massive iron gates of the estate. I bypassed the main entrance. I used an old trucker's access code on the service gate. It was a security system I had designed myself years ago, a system Derek was too arrogant to remember or understand. The crisp night air filled my lungs. I was hunting predators inside my own territory. As I approached the sprawling brick mansion, I saw it. A sleek black luxury rental car was parked discreetly behind the guest house. The engine hood was still warm. They were here. Derek and Nicole were inside the house they thought was completely empty, the house they thought contained the keys to their unearned kingdom. I reached into my pocket and gripped my phone. I pressed my thumb against the record button. I walked toward the back kitchen door. The silent adjustment had officially begun. I parked my truck a full mile away from the main estate. The roar of my diesel engine was a signature sound in this town. It was the sound of the logistics empire Simon and I had built from absolutely nothing. I could not risk that familiar rumble alerting the thieves hiding inside my dying brother's house. I zipped up my heavy canvas jacket and stepped out into the freezing night air. The walk was long and the biting wind whipped relentlessly against my face. My 70-year-old joints ached with the sharp cold, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. The profound betrayal burning inside my chest provided all the warmth I needed to keep putting one foot in front of the other. I reached the imposing perimeter wall of the grand estate. The towering iron gates at the front entrance were locked tight. High-definition security cameras swept the main driveway in a relentless and rhythmic pattern. I did not even approach the front. I walked along the dark tree line until I reached a rusted service gate entirely hidden behind a thick row of overgrown oak trees. This was the original access point we used back when we first bought this raw land to park our earliest freight rigs. I punched a 6-digit code into the old weather-beaten digital keypad mounted on the brick pillar. I designed this secondary security grid myself over 30 years ago when we started hauling high-value cargo across state lines. Derek was always far too arrogant to bother learning the gritty history of the company he planned to inherit. He assumed the modern upgrades simply replaced the foundational systems. He was wrong. The heavy iron gate clicked and swung open with a quiet metallic groan. I slipped inside the expansive grounds. I was a phantom moving silently through my own territory. The sprawling brick mansion loomed ahead in the oppressive darkness. Only a single window on the second floor emitted a harsh yellowish light. It was Simon's private home office. I moved quickly across the manicured lawn. I strictly avoided the gravel pathways to ensure my heavy work boots made absolutely no sound. I reached the back kitchen door. I pulled out my master key. The deadbolt slid back smoothly and silently. I stepped into the vast, dark kitchen. The air inside the luxury house felt remarkably heavy and stagnant. It felt exactly like a grand tomb waiting for a permanent occupant. I stood perfectly still in the darkness of the kitchen. I let my eyes fully adjust to the deep shadows. Then I heard it. A sharp, high-pitched mechanical whine echoed menacingly down the grand staircase. It was the distinct, undeniable sound of an angle grinder cutting through solid steel. Beneath the violent screech of the power tool, I could hear the rhythmic humming and crunching of a heavy-duty paper shredder. My pulse steadied into a slow, calculated beat. They were not merely looking for loose cash or jewelry to pawn. They were systematically dismantling the legal foundation of our entire life's work. I moved toward the base of the staircase. I placed my feet carefully on the very edge of the wooden steps to avoid making them creak under my weight. I climbed to the second floor and walked quietly down the thick, carpeted hallway. I stopped just outside the open door of my brother's office. I pressed my back firmly against the wall and peered cautiously around the doorframe. The scene unfolding inside the room was an absolute masterclass in unbridled greed. Derek stood directly in front of the mahogany bookshelf. He had pushed the heavy wooden shelves aside to permanently expose the hidden wall safe. He was sweating profusely in his expensive tailored designer shirt. He held a sparking angle grinder firmly against the thick steel hinges of the safe door. A brilliant shower of bright orange sparks rained down onto the expensive Persian rug, leaving tiny black burn marks. He cursed violently under his breath as the grinder slowly bit into the reinforced metal. A few feet away stood his wife, Nicole. She wore her pristine white designer dress despite the dirty task at hand. She stood over Simon's personal commercial paper shredder. She was frantically feeding thick stacks of critical documents directly into the machine. I recognized the distinct blue borders of the company's original physical property deeds. She was deliberately destroying the localized land titles for our regional distribution centers. She shoved another handful of irreplaceable papers into the shredding blades. She complained loudly about the fine dust ruining her expensive manicure. She told Derek to hurry up because the corrupt hospice nurse could call with the official news of Simon's death at any given minute. Her voice was completely devoid of any sorrow or human empathy. It was the frantic voice of a looter plundering a sinking ship. I watched them desecrate the very room where Simon and I had spent thousands of hours negotiating brutal contracts and saving our business from multiple economic recessions. The sheer audacity of their actions completely solidified my inner resolve. There would be no gentle family intervention. There would be no soft reprimand or demand for an apology. This was a hostile corporate takeover executed by blood relatives. The angle grinder let out a final loud screeching noise. The heavy steel hinges finally snapped under the pressure. Derek dropped the smoking tool onto the wooden floor and pried the heavy safe door open with a solid iron crowbar. He reached his hands inside the dark cavity. He frantically tossed aside velvet jewelry boxes and bound stacks of emergency cash. He was completely ignoring the surface wealth to look for something highly specific. Finally, his hands grasped a thick leather-bound legal folder. He pulled it out into the light and rapidly flipped through the dense pages. A cruel, triumphant laugh escaped his lips. He held the folder up high in the air. He told Nicole he had successfully found the master trust overrides. He told his wife the old man was too stupid to update the legal contingencies before the terrible coma finally took him. Nicole immediately stopped the shredder. Her eyes gleamed with a toxic, predatory satisfaction. She told her husband they were officially untouchable and that the logistics empire was finally theirs to liquidate. Derek tossed the heavy folder onto the wooden desk. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket. He tapped the bright screen and held the phone to his ear. He paced back and forth across the room as the late-night call connected. He spoke in a low, rushed tone, but the absolute silence of the grand hallway allowed me to hear every single word with perfect clarity. Derek greeted a man on the other end of the line. He called him Dr. Eris. My mind immediately connected the name to a private medical examiner operating a highly corrupt practice on the far east side of the city. Derek told the doctor that the time to act was right now. He strictly instructed the doctor to finalize the fraudulent paperwork immediately. He fiercely demanded the doctor backdate a severe dementia diagnosis for Ruben to exactly 6 months ago. Derek stated that the old black man was getting entirely too suspicious and needed to be permanently neutralized before the sun came up. Nicole walked over and leaned seductively against the desk. She smiled proudly at Derek as he finalized the brutal details of my demise. Derek told the doctor they were officially initiating the primary containment protocol. He instructed the doctor to have the private medical transport team waiting on immediate standby. Derek specified that the exact moment the hospice facility called to confirm Simon's death, the transport team needed to violently raid Ruben's house. Derek clearly outlined the strategy. They planned to drag me from my own bed in the middle of the night. They planned to use the forged medical documents to officially declare me a violent danger to myself and society. They were going to forcefully lock me in a state psychiatric facility indefinitely. Derek laughed coldly into the phone. He told the doctor that a senile man screaming about a stolen freight company would just sound like another crazy patient rapidly losing his mind. He promised to wire the remaining $50,000 to the doctor's offshore account by tomorrow afternoon. I stood in the dark hallway listening to my own nephew finalize my absolute destruction. They fully intended to steal my company and erase my freedom in one swift and merciless motion. The fiery rage in my chest cooled into a sharp, icy focus. I did not step into the room. I did not shout or confront them in a pointless, emotional rage. I reached silently into my canvas jacket pocket. I pulled out my mobile phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the voice recording application. I firmly pressed the red button. The digital timer started counting the seconds. I recorded every word of Derek's treacherous conversation. The silent adjustment required perfect, absolute patience. I had the confession. Now I needed to prepare for the inevitable war. I slipped out the back door of the estate with the exact same absolute silence that brought me inside. The biting frost of the early morning air stung my face as I walked the long mile back to my hidden truck. I avoided the paved roads to ensure the private security patrols circling the wealthy neighborhood would not spot a lone man walking in the dark. My phone sat heavy in my canvas jacket pocket. It held the digital audio of my own nephew orchestrating my permanent imprisonment in a psychiatric ward. I climbed into the cab of my truck and gripped the freezing steering wheel. I turned the key. The massive diesel engine roared to life, shattering the quiet night. I drove back to the hospice center under the cover of utter darkness. I had to beat the rising sun. I had to beat Derek and Nicole to the final battlefield. I walked back into Simon's room just as the fluorescent hallway lights flickered into their harsh daytime setting. The corrupt night nurse was packing her bag at the central station. She avoided my gaze completely. She hurried out the sliding glass doors with the heavy gait of a woman carrying a lucrative and filthy secret. I pulled the stiff plastic chair close to my brother's bed. I reached out and took his right hand. His skin was paper-thin and freezing, but the thick calluses on his palms remained completely intact. Those calluses were identical to mine. They were the permanent physical receipts of shifting heavy manual transmissions across the treacherous Rocky Mountains in the dead of winter. We hauled frozen freight through blinding blizzards in the late 70s to keep the bank from repossessing our only 2 functioning rigs. We built our national logistics empire on dangerous frozen highways and chronic lack of sleep. Now my fierce partner lay tethered to machines that beeped in a slow, agonizing rhythm. I squeezed his hand. I swallowed the violent rage threatening to tear my chest apart. I had to wear the mask of a broken, oblivious old man. I had to let them think they were winning this deadly game. At exactly 9 in the morning, the heavy wooden door swung open violently. Derek and Nicole burst into the room like actors hitting their marks on a brightly lit stage. Nicole wore an immaculate white designer dress that looked entirely out of place in a ward dedicated to impending death. She rushed toward the foot of the bed and unleashed a loud, theatrical sob. She brought perfectly manicured hands to her face. She produced forced tears without smudging a single drop of her expensive makeup. She made a highly calculated point to stand at least 2 feet away from the mattress. She absolutely refused to let her pristine fabric brush against the sterile hospital linens. She refused to touch the man who had blindly funded her lavish lifestyle for years. Derek threw himself toward the attending physician who had just stepped into the room to check the monitors. He gripped the doctor's hand with tight white knuckles. He buried his face in his free hand and wept with booming, echoing sobs. He played the part of the devastated loyal son flawlessly. If I had not stood in the shadows of the hallway mere hours ago and listened to him purchase a fake dementia diagnosis to lock me away, I might have believed his performance. I sat silently in my corner chair. I let my shoulders slump forward to project utter defeat. I made my eyes look vacant and exhausted. I played my part while they played theirs. The rhythm of the life support machines began to change drastically. Simon's chest stopped rising. The slow, steady beeps stretched into a continuous piercing tone. The heart monitor flatlined. The sharp, mechanical sound cut right through Derek's fake sobbing. The attending physician stepped forward and formally checked Simon's vitals. He clicked his pen and recorded the time on the chart attached to the end of the bed. He looked at us with practiced professional sympathy and pronounced my brother dead. A massive, crushing weight dropped onto my shoulders. The simmering anger vanished for a brief, profound moment. Pure, unadulterated grief washed over me. I reached out and gently closed Simon's eyes. 40 years of brotherhood had come to an end. 40 years of building a monumental logistics empire from diesel fumes and worn tires was officially over. It all ended in this cold, sterile room. I whispered a final, silent promise to him. I promised his legacy would not be devoured by the scavengers standing right behind me. The doctor and the nurses murmured their standard condolences and quietly stepped out of the room to give the family strict privacy. The heavy door clicked shut. The precise moment the metal latch engaged, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The theatrical performance abruptly and brutally ended. Derek immediately stopped crying. He stood up straight and rolled his shoulders to release the physical tension of his act. Nicole pulled a silk handkerchief from her pocket and dabbed her completely dry eyes. She pulled out her mobile phone and quickly checked her reflection in the dark screen to ensure her hair was still perfectly in place. She turned toward me. We were standing mere inches from my brother's lifeless body. The heart monitor had been turned off, but the silence in the room was absolutely deafening. Exactly 2 minutes had passed since the official time of death was pronounced by the doctor. Nicole did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not offer a hug or a sympathetic gesture. She reached straight into her oversized luxury handbag and pulled out a crisp, thick manila envelope. She took 2 deliberate steps toward my chair and held the envelope out to me. Her face was a mask of chilling corporate efficiency. Her voice held absolutely no trace of the sorrow she had projected seconds earlier. She coldly informed me that the envelope contained a formal legal eviction notice. She stated that the small wooden house I currently occupied on the edge of the company grounds was officially corporate property. She told me the logistics company was moving in a new strategic direction and required the asset to be liquidated immediately. She looked me dead in the eye and said I had exactly 30 days to pack my belongings and vacate the premises forever. Derek stood directly behind her. He crossed his arms over his chest and stared down at me with absolute contempt. He silently backed her aggressive play. He was establishing his new authority as the undisputed king of the freight empire. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg for extra time. He expected the senile, broken old man to crumble under the sheer weight of sudden impending homelessness. They were actively testing my mental state. They were aggressively probing my defenses before dropping the ultimate bomb of the fake psychiatric hold they had purchased the night before. I looked at the envelope in her hand. I looked at Nicole's smug, entitled face. I reached out slowly and took the heavy document from her manicured fingers. I did not say a single word to either of them. I simply nodded my head slowly and stared into the dark, bottomless abyss of their unhinged greed. The trap was perfectly set. They had boldly struck the first blow. Now it was my turn to initiate the silent adjustment. I held the manila envelope in my hands. The thick paper felt like a physical weight anchoring me to the reality of their betrayal. I did not utter a single syllable in protest. I let my shoulders slump forward until my posture mirrored the crushing grief of a defeated old man. I lowered my gaze to the sterile hospital floor. I nodded weakly as if the eviction notice was the final devastating blow that shattered my spirit. Nicole let out a sharp, satisfied breath. She adjusted her designer handbag and linked her arm through Derek's arm. Derek smirked. He looked down at me with the supreme arrogance of a conqueror who had just overthrown a dying king without firing a single shot. They turned and walked out of the room. Their expensive leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the linoleum hallway. They left me entirely alone with my dead brother. I stood in the profound silence of the room for several long minutes. I gently placed the eviction notice into my canvas jacket pocket. I looked at Simon one last time. I promised him again that his legacy would survive this venomous assault. I turned and walked out of the hospice facility. The morning sun was exceptionally bright and blinding. The cold air filled my lungs. The grief was still a heavy stone in my chest, but the blinding rage from the previous night had completely crystallized into absolute focus. I climbed into the cab of my truck. The diesel engine roared to life. I drove away from the hospital and headed straight for the company headquarters. I did not drive toward the sprawling brick mansion. I drove past the towering iron gates and headed toward the massive industrial truck yard. I parked my rig next to a small wooden house situated right on the edge of the sprawling concrete lot. This was my true home. When our logistics empire finally started generating massive corporate profits, Simon decided to build the grand estate. He wanted the towering columns and the sweeping manicured lawns. He wanted the physical manifestation of our monumental success. I wanted something entirely different. I chose to build this modest wooden house directly adjacent to the shipping yard. I wanted to wake up every single morning to the rhythmic rumble of heavy diesel engines firing up. I wanted to smell the exhaust and the burning rubber. I wanted to stay intimately connected to the actual heartbeat of the empire we built from absolute nothingness. Derek always mocked my living arrangement. He constantly told his country club friends that his uncle was just a glorified mechanic who refused to accept his own wealth. Derek never understood that my proximity to the yard gave me absolute operational awareness. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside the quiet house. The interior was simple and meticulously organized. I locked the deadbolt behind me. I walked straight into my modest bedroom and pushed my heavy oak bed frame aside. The hardwood floor beneath the bed looked entirely uniform. I knelt down and pressed my calloused fingers against a specific wooden plank. I applied pressure to the hidden latch mechanism. The floorboard clicked and popped open. I pulled back a rectangular section of the flooring to reveal a deep hidden cavity. I reached down into the dark space and hauled out a heavy fireproof lockbox. Derek and Nicole believed they had successfully neutralized my legal standing when they shredded the property deeds in Simon's office last night. They believed their midnight sabotage had erased my foundational rights. They were catastrophic fools. The documents they destroyed were merely operational copies. I placed the heavy metal lockbox onto my bed and entered the mechanical combination. The lid popped open. Inside lay the true, unalterable founding articles of our corporate trust. These were the original, heavily notarized documents Simon and I signed 40 years ago. These documents explicitly outlined a total executive override clause. They proved that in the event of Simon's incapacitation or death, I retained absolute supreme authority over every single company asset. Derek's freshly forged medical documents and fraudulent asset transfers were legally worthless against this ironclad foundation. I walked over to my modest wooden desk and booted up my encrypted laptop. I needed to assess the exact financial damage Derek had inflicted upon the company while I was distracted by Simon's declining health. 3 months ago, Derek had aggressively restricted my access to the executive digital dashboard. He claimed the company was migrating to a highly secure modern financial system. He insisted the new software was far too complex for me to navigate. He told me to simply focus on my retirement and leave the corporate accounting to his modern expertise. I had allowed him to lock me out because I was spending 14 hours a day at the hospice facility. I had trusted my own nephew to manage the accounts while I held my brother's hand. I opened the corporate financial portal. The login screen prompted me for a dual authentication credential. Derek had undoubtedly changed the primary passwords. He firmly believed I was permanently digitally exiled. He did not know that I had personally supervised the installation of this specific financial software 2 years ago. He did not know that the original developers had hardwired a Supreme Founder override code directly into the master mainframe. I typed the complex alphanumeric sequence into the terminal. The system hesitated for a fraction of a second before completely bypassing Derek's shallow security firewalls. The master digital ledger loaded onto my screen. I began to scan the intricate web of corporate accounts. I expected to find standard embezzlement. I fully expected to see bloated executive salaries and massive unauthorized transfers to Nicole's personal credit lines. I quickly found those exact transactions. They had bled hundreds of thousands of dollars from our operational reserves to fund their lavish vacations and designer wardrobes. But the minor theft was not what made my blood run entirely cold. As I dug deeper into the heavily obfuscated capital expenditure logs, I discovered a catastrophic financial crater. Derek had completely drained our primary liquid asset accounts. The company's emergency cash reserves were entirely decimated. I clicked into the specialized fleet acquisition folder. My heart pounded furiously against my ribs. Derek had executed a series of massive multi-million-dollar loans over the past 4 months. He had used the company's newest fleet of 70 commercial transport trucks as direct collateral. He had literally mortgaged the physical spine of our logistics empire. I pulled up the specific lien documents attached to the fleet. The registered lender was not a traditional corporate bank. It was an obscure shell company operating under a vague, generic title. I immediately recognized the business address listed on the digital contract. It was a notoriously corrupt address located in the industrial district of the city. The shell company was a known front for a ruthless underground gambling syndicate. Derek had not simply made poor business investments. He had leveraged our entire operational fleet to cover his massive, uncontrollable underground gambling debts. He had handed the keys of our empire over to violent, predatory criminals. I read the brutal terms of the predatory loan agreement. The interest rates were astronomically illegal. The repayment schedule was designed to guarantee total default. I scrolled down to the final page of the contract to check the maturity date. A massive balloon payment of $4 million was legally due in exactly 4 days. If Derek did not wire the funds to the syndicate by next Tuesday morning, the shell company was legally authorized to seize all 70 commercial trucks. They would simply arrive at the yard with armed repo men and drive our entire livelihood away. The logistics empire would physically stop moving. We would immediately default on all our major shipping contracts. 40 years of intense sacrifice and brutal labor would be auctioned off to loan sharks in less than 96 hours. The sheer magnitude of Derek's absolute recklessness threatened to suffocate me. He was not just a greedy, entitled heir trying to secure his inheritance early. He was a desperate, terrified addict frantically trying to save his own life by sacrificing everything his father had built. The eviction notice he handed me at the hospital was not just an act of cruelty. It was a desperate, calculated maneuver to clear the property before the financial collapse became public. He needed to sell the estate and my house immediately to cover the balloon payment. He needed me locked away in a psychiatric ward so I could not legally interfere with the desperate fire sale. I closed the laptop screen. I stood up and looked out the window toward the sprawling concrete yard. Dozens of trucks were currently being loaded for their cross-country routes. The drivers were hard-working men and women who relied on this company to feed their families. Derek was willing to destroy all of their lives just to cover his pathetic gambling debts. The illusion of my nephew was completely dead. He was an active, lethal threat to everything I loved. If I hesitated for a single second, the empire would burn to the ground. I grabbed the heavy fireproof lockbox and my encrypted laptop. I needed to assemble a war council immediately. The silent adjustment could no longer be a defensive strategy. It was time to aggressively hunt the predators. I grabbed my heavy canvas coat and walked out into the freezing morning air. I secured the fireproof lockbox and my encrypted laptop inside a nondescript duffel bag. I climbed into my truck and left the company yard. I drove away from the towering cranes and the endless rows of commercial trailers. I drove toward the forgotten industrial edge of the city. I navigated through the narrow, cracked streets lined with abandoned warehouses and rusted chain-link fences. I needed a sanctuary where the air was thick and the eyes were blind. I pulled into the uneven asphalt parking lot of a diner named Rusty's. It was a deeply dingy establishment. It was a relic from a forgotten era of the city. The neon sign above the door buzzed with an erratic, failing current. The air inside smelled permanently of stale grease and burnt bitter coffee. It was the perfect place to remain completely unseen. It was the perfect place to assemble a war council. I walked through the smudged glass doors and slid into a torn vinyl booth at the very back of the restaurant. The booth offered a clear, unobstructed view of the entrance. I ordered a black coffee from a waitress who did not care to look at my face. I sat in the dim light and waited. I listened to the low hum of the ancient refrigerator. I listened to the clatter of cheap silverware. 10 minutes later, the glass doors swung open. A man wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit walked into the diner. He looked entirely alien against the backdrop of peeling paint and faded linoleum. This was Oliver Hayes. Oliver was currently the most ruthless corporate attorney in the entire state. He was a legal predator who dismantled massive conglomerates before his morning coffee. He possessed a mind like a steel trap and a heart entirely devoid of mercy for his enemies. But I knew Oliver long before he wore expensive tailored fabrics. I knew him when he was a skinny, terrified kid sitting quietly in the passenger seat of an 18-wheeler. Oliver's father was named Marcus. Marcus drove heavy transport trucks for Simon and me back in the early 1980s. Marcus was one of our very first hires when the logistics company was nothing but a desperate dream. We took care of Marcus when our company was struggling to buy fuel. Marcus took care of us on the treacherous, icy highways, when Marcus tragically passed away from a sudden heart attack. I made a silent vow. I paid for Oliver's undergraduate degree. I paid for Oliver's prestigious law school tuition in absolute secrecy. I covered his housing and his books. I never asked for a single dime in return. I never held the debt over his head. Oliver knew the truth. Oliver possessed an absolute, unshakable loyalty to my family. He was the iron wolf I kept entirely off the official corporate books. Oliver slid into the booth across from me. He did not offer empty platitudes or hollow condolences about Simon. He knew I did not want pity. He knew I required immediate lethal action. I placed the heavy duffel bag onto the sticky laminate table. I pulled out my encrypted laptop. I pulled out my mobile phone and set it precisely in the center of the table. I looked Oliver dead in the eye. I told him the logistics empire was actively burning to the ground. I told him my own nephew was holding the match and pouring the gasoline. I tapped the screen of my mobile phone. I pressed play. I let Oliver listen to the digital audio recording I had captured in the dark shadows of the grand estate. Oliver sat perfectly motionless. His dark eyes remained fixed on the glowing screen of the phone. He listened to Derek instruct the corrupt medical examiner to fabricate a severe dementia diagnosis. He listened to Derek finalize the violent plan to drag me from my bed in the middle of the night. He listened to my nephew plot to lock me inside a state psychiatric ward until I died. Oliver did not blink. He did not react with theatrical shock. His face hardened into a mask of pure, absolute fury. He recognized the sheer malice in Derek's voice. He recognized the profound betrayal of blood. When the audio recording finally finished, Oliver let out a slow, measured breath. He looked down at my closed laptop. I opened the laptop and turned the bright screen toward him. I bypassed the security protocols and loaded the master financial ledger. I showed Oliver the catastrophic financial crater Derek had secretly dug beneath our feet. I showed him the massive predatory loans Derek had illegally secured against our primary commercial fleet. I showed him the terrifying balloon payment due to the violent underground gambling syndicate by next Tuesday morning. I explained that Derek had literally mortgaged the physical spine of our logistics empire to cover his pathetic gambling addiction. I explained that if we failed to act within 96 hours, the loan sharks would arrive with armed repo men and seize 70 transport trucks. The entire company would instantly collapse. Oliver stared at the red numbers bleeding across the digital ledger. The brilliant lawyer inside him immediately took total control. He systematically analyzed the monumental threat. He told me we could file an emergency injunction to temporarily halt the impending repossession. He told me we could challenge the fraudulent loans in civil court and tie the syndicate up in endless litigation. I shook my head slowly. I told him civil court was merely a slap on the wrist. I told him an injunction would only delay the inevitable destruction. I told him Derek and Nicole needed to be completely dismantled. I wanted them to face absolute permanent ruin for trying to erase my existence. I wanted them stripped of every single illusion of power. Oliver smiled a slow, highly dangerous smile. He understood my parameters perfectly. He closed the laptop with a sharp click. He leaned across the table. He told me we had to elevate this conflict from a messy family civil dispute to a mandatory federal felony. He began to draft a brilliant and devastating legal trap. Oliver explained the precise mechanics of the ambush. Derek was currently operating under the fatal assumption that I was entirely defeated. Derek believed the shredded property deeds and the impending fake dementia diagnosis gave him total absolute immunity. We needed to aggressively use his monumental arrogance against him. Oliver stated we must force Derek to officially sign a fraudulent asset transfer document. The document needed to legally transfer the entire commercial fleet directly into Derek's personal name. But he could not just sign it in the privacy of his stolen office. He had to sign it in front of a licensed federal notary. Oliver explained that submitting forged corporate ownership documents to a federal official instantly triggered severe mandatory federal prison sentences. It crossed the rigid line from corporate mismanagement to federal wire fraud and grand embezzlement. We needed to push Derek into making that one fatal signature. We needed to convince him that signing that specific paper was his only viable path to accessing the liquid cash he desperately needed to pay the gambling syndicate. We had to make the bait completely irresistible. Oliver pulled his own secure tablet from his sleek leather briefcase. He immediately tapped into his private investigative databases. He ran a rapid, comprehensive background check on Derek and Nicole's immediate personal financial footprints. He wanted to measure their exact level of current desperation. He wanted to know how hard we needed to push. His fingers flew across the digital keyboard with practiced speed. He stopped abruptly. He leaned forward and stared intently at a newly generated file on his screen. He looked up at me with a sharp, urgent warning in his dark eyes. Oliver told me we had a massive secondary problem. He told me Derek was not the only one frantically liquidating family assets to survive. Nicole was actively drowning in her own ocean of secret debt. Her personal luxury credit cards were completely maxed out. She had received multiple final default notices from premium fashion retailers and luxury vehicle dealerships. Oliver tapped the screen to reveal a private underground auction listing. He turned the tablet so I could read the bold text. He told me Nicole had just scheduled a massive expedited liquidation sale for the upcoming weekend. She was planning to sell off Simon's prized antique vehicle collection to generate immediate, untraceable cash. She had secretly contracted a shady private auctioneer to clear out the massive climate-controlled garage at the main estate. Simon had spent 30 agonizing years meticulously restoring those classic cars. They were his absolute mechanical masterpieces. They were the only things he loved more than the freight company. Nicole was eagerly selling them for pennies on the dollar to buy herself a few more months of superficial luxury. The clock was ticking significantly faster than I had anticipated. The war was expanding to a second front. The massive stained glass windows filtered the pale morning light into the echoing cavern of the church. The sanctuary was a sprawling expanse of polished mahogany and cold gray stone. I sat completely alone in the very last pew. I wore my only tailored black suit. Simon's casket rested at the front of the long central aisle. It was an expensive, heavy wooden box draped in a massive, ostentatious display of rare white lilies. It was a beautiful and sterile arrangement paid for by the corporate accounts Derek was actively draining. I stared at the back of Derek's head. I surveyed the massive sanctuary. The long wooden benches were 80% empty. This was a man who employed hundreds of fiercely loyal workers. This was a man who knew the names of his driver's children and paid for their medical emergencies. I scanned the sparse crowd for the familiar, hardened faces of the veteran drivers. I specifically looked for Big Mike, who hauled raw timber out of the treacherous Pacific Northwest. I looked for Sarah, who ran the hazardous material routes down the freezing eastern seaboard. I looked for the aging mechanics who kept our first rusted rigs running on sheer willpower and ingenuity. Not a single company employee was present in the building. I realized the sickening truth immediately. Derek had actively barred every single worker from attending the funeral. He had hired armed private security guards to stand at the heavy church doors. He had issued a strict corporate memo declaring the funeral an exclusive private family event. He deliberately erased the gritty blue-collar foundation of our entire lives. He did not want grease-stained hands sullying his high society performance. He wanted a controlled, sterile audience of wealthy country club acquaintances to witness his fake manufactured grief. The organist began to play a slow, mournful hymn. Nicole stood closely beside Derek in the front row. She wore a tight black designer dress that belonged at a late-night cocktail party rather than a somber funeral. She wore a massive black fascinator hat featuring a delicate, intricate veil. She shifted her weight constantly from one expensive stiletto heel to the other. The heavy wooden doors of the church stood wide open to let in the biting morning air. Nicole dramatically fanned her face with a heavy printed program. She complained loudly and bitterly about the damp winter humidity ruining her expensive salon blowout. Her shrill voice carried sharply over the quiet organ music. It was a grating, arrogant sound that profoundly disrespected the heavy silence of death. She turned around and scanned the empty back rows. Her cold eyes locked directly onto my hunched figure. She snapped her perfectly manicured fingers in my direction. She did not call my name. She treated me exactly like a hired disposable servant. I stood up slowly from the hard wooden bench. I purposefully kept my broad shoulders slumped. I walked down the long center aisle toward her. I forced my strong legs to move with a fragile, trembling gait. She leaned toward me as I approached. She did not bother to whisper. She loudly ordered me to go out to the front vestibule and fetch her a bottle of imported sparkling water. She explicitly specified the expensive brand. She aggressively stated her throat was terribly parched from crying all morning. She had not shed a single genuine tear. I nodded weakly. I turned around and walked back down the aisle. I played the broken, submissive old man flawlessly. I retrieved her expensive water from the lavish catering table. I walked back into the cold sanctuary. I approached the front pew just as Nicole turned to speak to a wealthy local socialite. The older woman was the wife of a prominent regional bank executive. Nicole accepted the cold water bottle from my hand without making any eye contact. She leaned intimately close to the wealthy socialite. She spoke in a loud, carrying stage whisper specifically designed to be heard by everyone nearby. She gestured subtly toward my retreating back. She dropped the heavy toxic narrative Derek had engineered the night before. She told the wealthy woman that Simon's death was a profound tragedy, but the real ongoing tragedy was my rapid mental decline. She claimed my mind was completely failing. She sighed heavily and placed a delicate hand over her heart. She told the woman that Derek and she were now heavily burdened with my constant, exhaustive care. She claimed I frequently forgot where I was and wandered the estate at night. She lied smoothly and said I was rapidly becoming a violent physical danger to myself and others. She painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a deeply senile man requiring immediate permanent institutionalization. She played the tragic, exhausted martyr carrying the heavy weight of a broken, deteriorating family. The wealthy socialite patted Nicole's arm with profound, genuine sympathy. The woman looked at me with deep, unsettling pity. I absorbed the vicious, calculated lie. I absorbed the intense, public humiliation. I kept my head down and my expression entirely blank. I returned to the cold wooden bench at the back of the church. I filed her precise words away in the iron vault of my mind. Their dark strategy was moving forward at a terrifying, aggressive speed. They were laying the necessary public groundwork for my sudden permanent disappearance. They deeply needed the city's elite class to nod in sympathetic agreement when the private medical transport team hauled me away in the middle of the night. The funeral service finally concluded with a hollow, rehearsed prayer. The sparse crowd moved out into the biting, violent wind of the cemetery. The sky above was a flat, impenetrable sheet of freezing gray clouds. The premium burial plot was situated on a small, manicured hill overlooking the sprawling industrial city. The cemetery workers silently lowered Simon's heavy casket into the frozen, unforgiving earth. I stood 20 yards away from the main gathering. I stood alone under the bare, shivering branches of a massive ancient elm tree. I watched Derek wrap his arm tightly around Nicole's waist. They stood right at the edge of the open grave, playing the perfect picture of devastated heirs. The few wealthy society guests offered their final hollow condolences and began walking quickly back toward their heated luxury vehicles. The wind howled aggressively across the polished stone markers. Derek stepped away from the grave to speak privately with the funeral director. Suddenly, a strange man stepped out from the deep shadows of a large marble mausoleum. The man absolutely did not belong at a high society funeral. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit that offered no protection from the cold. His neck was exceptionally thick and covered in faded, jagged tattoos. His knuckles were heavily scarred and bruised. My sharp eyes recognized the specific breed of violence immediately. I had spent 40 grueling years managing rough freight yards in dangerous neighborhoods. I had dealt personally with dockyard muscle and brutal extortion rackets. This man was not a grieving friend paying his respects. This man was a brutal, aggressive enforcer for the underground gambling syndicate. He walked directly up to Derek. He completely ignored the heavy solemnity of the graveyard. He crowded Derek aggressively against a tall granite monument. He shoved a thick, heavy finger hard against Derek's expensive suit chest. Derek panicked instantly. His confident, arrogant facade shattered into a million pieces. His face drained of all natural color. He looked frantically over his shoulder to see if Nicole or the remaining wealthy guests were watching the confrontation. I stood perfectly still behind the thick trunk of the elm tree. I focused entirely on their desperate physical exchange. The enforcer leaned in close and delivered a sharp, violent verbal threat. Derek shoved the man's heavy hand away with trembling, frantic urgency. Derek hissed desperately right into the enforcer's scarred face. The freezing wind carried his high-pitched, panicked voice directly across the frozen dead grass. Derek swore to the enforcer that the money was completely legally secured. He swore the massive fleet of commercial trucks was officially sold to a private buyer. Derek promised the violent enforcer that the entire $4 million balloon payment would be wired directly to the syndicate the absolute second the banks opened on Monday morning. The enforcer glared at Derek with cold, dead, predatory eyes. He slowly adjusted his cheap suit jacket. He promised Derek that Monday morning was his absolute final breath on this earth. The enforcer turned sharply and walked away through the endless rows of gray gravestones. Derek stood completely alone by his father's open grave, trembling with sheer, unadulterated terror. He pulled his mobile phone from his pocket and began dialing with frantic, shaking fingers. I stood in the freezing wind and processed the fatal shifting timeline. The violent collision course had just aggressively accelerated. Oliver and I had originally calculated we had until late Tuesday afternoon to properly spring the federal trap. Derek's panicked graveyard confession just severely compressed the absolute deadline. Monday morning was the new point of no return. Monday morning was the exact day Derek intended to officially liquidate 70 commercial transport trucks to save his own pathetic life. Monday morning was the day he would leave hundreds of my dedicated drivers permanently unemployed and bankrupt my brother's entire lifelong legacy. I had exactly 48 hours to force Derek into signing the fraudulent corporate transfer documents in front of a licensed federal notary. I had exactly 48 hours to push Nicole into eagerly executing her illegal antique car auction. I turned my back on the open grave. I walked swiftly toward my hidden truck. I had to call Oliver immediately. We had to bait the trap tonight. The waiting was over. The war had arrived. I sat across from Oliver Hayes in the dim glow of my small kitchen. The digital clock on the microwave read midnight. The ticking clock of our 48-hour deadline hammered in my brain. I opened the heavy fireproof lockbox on my dining table. I pulled out the original founding articles of the trust. I laid the thick parchment pages flat under the harsh overhead light. Oliver adjusted his glasses and ran his sharp eyes over the dense legal text. He was looking for the specific mechanism I had mentioned on the phone. He found it on page 42. It was a deeply buried dead man's switch clause. Simon and I drafted this specific addendum in the late 80s. We had just survived a brutal hostile takeover attempt by a rival logistics firm. We swore we would never leave our company exposed to sudden catastrophic vulnerability again. The clause dictated that upon the death or incapacitation of either founding brother, all primary corporate accounts would automatically trigger a hard security freeze. The freeze could only be lifted by the surviving founder presenting physical authorization codes. Derek completely ignored this massive legal landmine. Derek believed modern digital banking superseded physical paper contracts. He was fatally wrong. Oliver connected his secure tablet to my encrypted laptop. He rapidly bypassed the secondary security walls using his specialized legal software. He aligned the digital override sequence with the physical authorization codes I provided from the lockbox. We watched the master financial dashboard flicker on the screen. The glowing green numbers representing the massive corporate cash reserves suddenly turned a harsh warning red. A heavy digital padlock icon materialized across every single primary operating account. The master credit lines were instantly severed. The corporate black cards distributed to the executive suite were completely deactivated. Every single drop of liquid capital was officially trapped behind a wall of impenetrable legal ice. Oliver sat back and closed his briefcase. He looked at me with absolute predatory satisfaction. He confirmed that the financial veins of the logistics empire were completely frozen. Derek and Nicole were now officially cut off from their stolen lifeblood. The next morning would bring a sudden, violent awakening. The morning sun broke over the city with a sharp, freezing clarity. Nicole did not waste a single moment. She arrived at the premier European auto dealership precisely when the massive glass doors opened. She had scheduled a private viewing of a limited edition luxury sports car. She intended to purchase the vehicle outright using the company's master expense account. She planned to quickly flip the rare car to a private collector for untraceable cash before the weekend was over. This was her desperate strategy to build a personal escape fund before Derek's massive gambling debts brought the entire house down. She strode onto the immaculate showroom floor wearing her designer sunglasses and an expensive mink coat. She carried herself with the supreme arrogance of royalty inspecting a conquered province. She bypassed the standard sales associates and walked directly into the general manager's glass office. She sat down and aggressively tapped her long manicured nails against his polished mahogany desk. She demanded immediate service. She explicitly told him to prepare the final purchasing paperwork for the silver sports car sitting in the center display. The manager eagerly complied. He offered her imported sparkling water and printed the heavy stack of legal documents. Nicole signed the papers with rapid, careless strokes. She did not bother to read a single line of text. She reached into her oversized handbag and pulled out the heavy metal corporate black card. She tossed it onto the desk with a dismissive flick of her wrist. She ordered him to run the card for the full $200,000 purchase price immediately. The manager smiled and swiped the heavy metal card through his secure terminal. He waited for the approving green light. The machine beeped sharply. The screen flashed a harsh red warning message. The transaction was completely declined. The manager frowned and apologized profusely. He assumed it was a simple automated security flag due to the massive purchase amount. He swiped the card a second time. The machine rejected the transaction instantly. A secondary message appeared commanding the merchant to confiscate the card. The manager's overly polite smile began to falter. He politely informed Nicole that the primary account was experiencing a strict administrative hold. Nicole's face flushed with sudden violent indignation. She snatched the metal card back from his hand. She yelled that his terminal was obviously broken. She rummaged through her designer bag and pulled out a secondary platinum credit card linked directly to Derek's executive expense account. She slammed it onto the desk. She commanded him to run the secondary card and stop wasting her highly valuable time. The manager swiped the platinum card. The terminal rejected it before he even finished the motion. The account was flagged as frozen. Nicole's breathing grew shallow and erratic. The The pristine mask of immense wealth was rapidly cracking under the pressure of reality. She pulled out her personal gold card. This was her absolute final lifeline. She practically threw it at the manager. Her hands were visibly shaking. The manager swiped the third card. The system instantly declined the transaction due to insufficient funds and a total locked status. The heavy silence in the glass office was absolutely deafening. The manager looked at the 3 declined cards resting on his desk. He looked at Nicole's flushed, panicked face. The eager, sycophantic customer service vanished from his demeanor entirely. He realized he was not dealing with a wealthy socialite. He was dealing with a fraud. He slowly slid the unexecuted contract across the desk. He politely but firmly asked Nicole to leave his showroom immediately. Nicole stood up. She tried to formulate a harsh verbal attack, but the words died in her throat. She grabbed her useless plastic cards and marched out of the dealership. The showroom staff watched her humiliated retreat with poorly concealed amusement. Her absolute worst nightmare had just materialized in front of an audience. Nicole practically flew out of the dealership parking lot. Her rage completely consumed her remaining logic. She did not call Derek. She did not call the bank. Her entitled mind aggressively sought a scapegoat. She connected the sudden financial lockout to the exact moment I accepted the eviction notice in the hospital. She drove her luxury SUV recklessly across town. She bypassed the sprawling brick mansion and headed straight for the industrial truck yard. She brought her vehicle to a violent screeching halt right in front of my modest wooden house. The tires kicked up a massive cloud of freezing gravel. I was sitting quietly at my kitchen table drinking a cup of strong black coffee. I watched her aggressive arrival through the window. I did not move. I did not flinch. Nicole stomped up the wooden steps of my porch. She hammered her fists violently against my heavy front door. The loud thumping echoed across the busy truck yard. Several veteran drivers stopped loading their rigs and watched the wealthy, hysterical woman pounding on my door. Nicole screamed at the top of her lungs. She completely abandoned her refined high society vocabulary. She hurled vicious insults and furious accusations through the solid wood. She screamed that I was a vindictive, senile old man. She demanded to know what twisted, illegal trick I had used to tamper with her personal accounts. She yelled that I had absolutely no right to touch the corporate money. She claimed she would have me thrown onto the street by noon. I remained perfectly seated at my table. I took another slow, calculated sip of my dark coffee. Her voice grew increasingly hysterical. The panic of her massive secret debts was bleeding through her aggressive threats. She realized she could not buy the antique cars. She realized she could not fund her escape. She realized the financial fortress was permanently locked. Nicole kicked the base of my door with her expensive stiletto. She screamed her final desperate ultimatum. She yelled that I had officially crossed the line. She stated she was dialing the police right this very second. She promised to hand them the backdated dementia diagnosis the moment they arrived. She shrieked that she would have the officers drag me directly to the state psychiatric ward in handcuffs. She swore I would spend the rest of my miserable life locked in a padded white room. I set my coffee mug down on the table. The sharp click of the ceramic against the wood matched the steady ticking of my watch. The enemy was reacting exactly as Oliver and I had predicted. The silent adjustment was ready for the next lethal phase. Nicole did not dial the police herself. She knew she lacked the official forged paperwork. She spun on her expensive stiletto heels and marched back to her luxury vehicle. She slammed the car door and sped out of the industrial yard. She was undoubtedly calling Derek to execute their primary containment protocol immediately. I did not panic. I did not rush to pack a bag or flee the property. I walked into my bedroom and opened my modest closet. I bypassed my heavy canvas work jackets and denim shirts. I reached for a tailored charcoal suit I rarely wore. I put on a crisp white shirt and tied a solid black silk tie. I polished my dark leather shoes until they gleamed brightly under the bedroom light. I wanted to present the exact opposite image of a deteriorating, senile old man. I walked back into the kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The bitter, familiar aroma filled the small wooden house. I poured the steaming liquid into a clean ceramic mug. I sat back down at the heavy oak dining table. I waited with the absolute patience of a man holding an unbeatable hand. I knew desperation would make Derek careless. Less than 40 minutes passed before heavy tires crunched aggressively against the freezing gravel outside my window. I looked through the slatted blinds. A black and white city police cruiser parked directly behind Derek's sleek silver sports car. The flashing red and blue lights painted the side of my house in a frantic warning rhythm. 2 uniformed police officers stepped out of the cruiser. They looked exceptionally tense and highly alert. They unclipped the heavy retaining straps on their duty belts. They were clearly briefed to handle a highly volatile and potentially violent psychiatric patient. Derek climbed out of his luxury car. He smoothed the sharp lapels of his expensive winter jacket. A smug, triumphant smirk completely dominated his face. He believed he was delivering the absolute final blow to my existence. He walked briskly toward my front porch. He pointed aggressively at my door while speaking rapidly to the approaching officers. He played the deeply concerned and exhausted family member to absolute perfection. He led the officers up the wooden steps. He did not bother to knock. He reached out and aggressively rattled the doorknob. He expected to find a confused, frightened old man cowering in the dark. I stood up from the table. I walked to the door and smoothly disengaged the heavy brass deadbolt. I pulled the front door wide open. I stood perfectly straight in my tailored charcoal suit. I held my coffee mug calmly in my right hand. I looked at the 3 men on my porch with absolute, unwavering authority. Derek's triumphant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. He clearly did not expect me to look like a high-level corporate executive. He expected a broken mechanic in stained overalls. He recovered his composure quickly and turned toward the taller police officer. Derek pointed his finger directly at my chest. He declared loudly that I was suffering from severe advanced dementia. He stated that my mental deterioration had rapidly escalated into violent paranoia over the past 24 hours. He claimed I was actively tampering with essential corporate assets and freezing critical company bank accounts. He told the officers I was a profound physical danger to myself and an active threat to the massive logistics business my late brother had built. He reached inside his tailored jacket pocket. He produced a thick manila folder and handed it confidently to the lead officer. Derek stated the folder contained a certified medical directive from Dr. Aris. He claimed the paperwork granted him immediate emergency guardianship. He demanded the officers forcibly restrain me and transport me directly to the state psychiatric ward. The lead officer took the folder. He looked down at the forged medical documents. He looked back up at me. He evaluated my calm posture and my steady, unblinking gaze. He asked me if my name was Reuben. I took a slow sip of my hot coffee. I nodded once. I told the officer my name and my exact date of birth. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. I stepped back from the doorway. I gestured toward my clean, organized living room. I politely invited both officers to step out of the freezing wind and come inside my home. I told them we could discuss these severe accusations in a civilized, rational manner. The officers exchanged a brief, uncertain look. They stepped over the threshold. Derek followed closely behind them. He glared at me with sheer, unadulterated hatred. He was furious that the officers had not immediately tackled me to the floor. He paced aggressively across my living room. He loudly demanded the police stop wasting time and execute the medical transport order. I completely ignored my nephew. I walked over to the heavy oak dining table. I set my coffee mug down next to my fireproof lockbox. I looked directly at the lead officer. I told him I fully understood the severe nature of Derek's claims. I stated that a sudden medical diagnosis of advanced dementia was a highly serious matter requiring undeniable proof. I reached into the lockbox. I pulled out a pristine blue folder bearing the embossed golden seal of the State Medical Board. I handed the folder to the officer. I told him he was currently holding a comprehensive certified psychiatric evaluation. I explained that the evaluation was officially conducted exactly 2 days ago by Dr. Evelyn Vance. Dr. Vance was the state's foremost leading neurologist. She was the absolute top authority on cognitive decline and neurodegenerative diseases in the entire region. I had quietly visited her private clinic immediately after Simon fell into his coma. I knew Derek would eventually try to attack my mental fitness to seize the company. I had prepared my medical defense weeks in advance. The lead officer opened the blue folder. He read the heavily stamped conclusions. Dr. Vance had officially certified my mental acuity as absolutely perfect. She had legally documented my cognitive function as scoring in the highest possible percentile for my age group. The evaluation explicitly stated I displayed 0 signs of dementia, paranoia, or cognitive impairment. The date stamped off the pristine official document completely obliterated the backdated forgery Derek had purchased from his corrupt contact. The lead officer finished reading the certified evaluation. He closed the blue folder with a sharp snap. He looked at Derek with eyes that had grown completely cold and highly suspicious. He held up the forged paperwork Derek had provided. He asked Derek to explain the massive, blatant contradiction. Derek's face drained of all natural color. He stammered uselessly. He tried to claim my document was a cheap internet forgery. He frantically insisted his uncle was a master manipulator. He aggressively demanded the police arrest me for corporate sabotage regardless of the medical dispute. He yelled that I had maliciously locked the corporate accounts and was illegally destroying his personal business. I reached back into the fireproof lockbox. I pulled out the original founding articles of the trust. I handed the heavy parchment document to the second officer. I told the police that the logistics empire did not belong to my nephew. I pointed to the specific notarized executive override clauses. I calmly informed the officers that I officially owned exactly 60% of the entire corporation. I stated that my brother Simon and I built the company together and that the master legal trust granted me absolute total control upon his passing. I explained that freezing the corporate bank accounts was my legal right and my strict fiduciary duty as the majority owner. I stated I was simply protecting my assets from a disgruntled family member who was actively attempting to embezzle company funds. The second officer reviewed the original founding documents. He verified the massive corporate seals and the undeniable legal signatures. He handed the papers back to me with a distinct nod of professional respect. The lead officer turned his full physical attention directly onto Derek. He stepped forward and aggressively invaded Derek's personal space. The officer's voice was low and heavy with absolute authority. He sternly warned Derek about the severe criminal penalties for filing false police reports and submitting forged medical documents to law enforcement. He explicitly told Derek that attempting to weaponize the city police department to execute a fraudulent corporate takeover was a fast track to a state prison cell. He strongly advised Derek to leave my property immediately before they decided to officially arrest him for public disturbance and criminal harassment. Derek stood completely frozen in the center of my living room. His grand master plan had just spectacularly violently imploded. He looked at the two armed officers who were now actively protecting my rights. He looked at my calm, unwavering face. The absolute sheer humiliation burned entirely through his expensive suit. He realized his uncle was not a helpless target waiting to be slaughtered. He realized I was fully, completely aware of his crimes and heavily armed for total legal war. Derek turned around and practically ran out of my house. He slammed the front door so hard the wooden frame rattled. The trap was holding. Desperation would soon force him to make the ultimate fatal mistake. The sun slowly dipped below the jagged industrial skyline. The sprawling concrete yard grew completely quiet as the final shift of dock workers drove their vehicles through the heavy iron gates. I locked the deadbolt on my front door. I turned off every single lamp inside my modest wooden house. I pulled my heavy armchair directly in front of the front window. I sat in the absolute pitch-black darkness and looked out over the freezing asphalt. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, absolute certainty. I knew the fundamental psychology of desperate people. I knew that when a predator is suddenly backed into an inescapable corner, it stops calculating its moves. It completely abandons logic and resorts to blind, violent instinct. Derek had just suffered a monumental, humiliating defeat in front of armed police officers. He realized his forged medical documents were entirely worthless. He realized the corporate bank accounts were legally frozen solid. He was currently suffocating under a $4 million deadline from a violent underground gambling syndicate. Desperate men always make incredibly loud mistakes. I simply sat in the freezing darkness and waited for the noise. The biting winter cold began to seep through the thin wooden walls of my house. The digital clock on the microwave glowed a faint neon green in the kitchen. It read 2 a.m. when the heavy silence finally shattered. I heard the sharp, violent crack of a heavy steel crowbar striking the external electrical box mounted on the side of my house. The green light of the microwave vanished instantly. The low, constant hum of the ancient refrigerator died. The heavy-duty space heaters positioned in the corners of the room powered down with a hollow click. The complete darkness was suddenly matched by the rapid, terrifying drop in temperature. Derek had brutally severed the primary power line connecting my house to the main corporate grid. It was a crude, incredibly petty tactic. He believed stripping away my basic survival utilities would instantly break my spirit. He believed a 71-year-old man would freeze in the dark and beg for mercy. He fundamentally failed to understand that I had survived decades of freezing nights sleeping in the cramped cabs of unheated transport trucks. The sudden cold did not frighten me. It merely confirmed his absolute lack of strategic intelligence. A low, guttural roar suddenly vibrated through the wooden floorboards beneath my boots. A massive cloud of thick, black diesel smoke plumed into the freezing night air. I recognized the distinct mechanical rhythm of the engine immediately. It was our company's primary heavy-duty recovery wrecker. It was a massive specialized tow truck designed to haul fully loaded commercial trailers out of deep roadside ditches. Derek had clearly stolen a spare ignition key from the master dispatch board inside the main office. He aggressively revved the massive engine. The yellow flashing hazard lights mounted on the roof of the wrecker sliced wildly through the dense winter fog. He drove the heavy truck recklessly across the concrete yard. He threw the transmission into reverse and backed the massive steel rear bumper directly toward my small detached garage. He slammed the brakes and threw the truck into park. The air brakes hissed violently. Derek jumped down from the tall cab of the wrecker. He carried the heavy steel crowbar in his right hand. He marched aggressively toward the wooden doors of my garage. He raised the crowbar and smashed the heavy brass padlock with 3 violent, uncoordinated strikes. The broken lock clattered against the freezing asphalt. Derek kicked the doors wide open. Inside the dark garage sat my absolute most prized possession. It was a classic, pristine silver Mustang. It was a flawless mechanical masterpiece. I had spent 15 years hunting down original parts and rebuilding the entire engine block completely by hand. The car represented countless hours of meticulous, patient labor. It was the physical manifestation of my entire philosophy. I built things that lasted. Derek did not care about the history or the craftsmanship. He dragged heavy, thick steel recovery chains across the rough asphalt. He aggressively hooked the abrasive metal links directly onto the pristine front axle of the classic car. He did not bother to use protective nylon straps. The heavy metal instantly scratched the flawless silver paint. He marched back to the controls of the wrecker and engaged the hydraulic winch. The heavy steel cable snapped taut. The massive hydraulic gears screamed in the quiet night. Derek violently dragged my beautiful car out of the garage. The front tires locked and screeched harshly against the concrete. He was stealing the car as a childish, immediate hostage. He planned to hold the physical vehicle over my head to force a legal surrender. A shrill, arrogant voice suddenly pierced the freezing night air. Nicole stood safely behind the heavy wrought iron gate that separated the grimy industrial yard from the sweeping manicured lawns of the grand estate. The bitter wind aggressively whipped her expensive designer coat around her thin legs. She cupped her gloved hands around her mouth and screamed directly into the darkness toward my house. She completely abandoned her refined high society persona. She yelled that I would freeze to death in the dark wooden shack. She shrieked that the power would remain permanently severed until I crawled on my hands and knees to the main house. She demanded I immediately sign the corporate transfer documents releasing the entire commercial fleet into Derek's name. She loudly promised to return the stolen Mustang and restore the electrical heat only when Derek possessed total, absolute legal control of the company. She believed the biting physical cold and the petty theft of my car would force total submission. She believed she held all the leverage. I stood perfectly still by the dark window. I did not yell back. I did not step out onto the front porch to argue. I completely ignored her frantic, hysterical screaming. Engaging with a desperate amateur is a massive strategic failure. I pulled my mobile phone from the inner pocket of my heavy jacket. The bright screen illuminated my calm, steady face in the pitch-black room. I opened a highly encrypted utility application I had specifically installed 3 years ago. I had anticipated a day when my own blood might try to cut me off from the world. I tapped a single complex digital command. Deep beneath the hardwood floorboards of my kitchen, a heavily insulated mechanical compartment engaged. An independent military-grade satellite generator quietly hummed to life. The heavy-duty machine bypassed the destroyed external electrical box entirely. The lights inside my house instantly flickered back on. The space heaters roared to life, pushing a wave of intense, beautiful warmth through the freezing rooms. I stood bathed in the bright, warm light while Nicole continued screaming into the void outside. I walked to the kitchen table and dialed Oliver's private secure number. He answered on the very first ring. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. I told Oliver that Derek had officially escalated the conflict to physical theft and property destruction. I told him Derek was currently dragging my Mustang across the yard with a company wrecker. Oliver did not react with shock. He simply asked for my final authorization. I looked out the window at Derek's frantic movements. I gave Oliver the green light. I authorized him to immediately file the emergency federal injunction we had drafted earlier that evening. The injunction was not a defensive maneuver. It was a massive, lethal offensive strike. Oliver was filing federal documents demanding an immediate comprehensive audit of Derek's personal financial accounts based on heavily documented suspicion of corporate embezzlement. The federal judge would instantly freeze every single personal bank account, credit line, and hidden asset Derek and Nicole possessed. By the time the sun rose, they would not be able to buy a cup of coffee. The trap was officially sprung. They thought they were freezing me out, but I was about to completely suffocate their entire existence. The freezing morning sun broke over the jagged industrial horizon. It cast long, sharp shadows across the cracked concrete of the truck yard. I did not sleep a single minute. I spent the remaining dark hours meticulously reviewing Oliver's digital dispatches inside my illuminated house. The emergency federal injunction had successfully detonated exactly at dawn. Derek and Nicole were currently waking up to the catastrophic reality of entirely frozen personal assets. Their premium credit cards were violently suspended. Their private banking portals were locked under strict federal mandate. They were officially trapped in a suffocating financial vacuum. But starving the enemy of their liquid resources was only the first half of the war. I had to permanently dismantle the false legal narrative they had constructed to erase my existence. I had to sever the corrupt roots of their manufactured dementia diagnosis before they could attempt another police raid. I stood up from my kitchen table and walked toward my bedroom. I needed to physically hunt down the architect of the medical forgery. I opened my modest closet and selected a dark navy suit. I buttoned a fresh, crisp white shirt and adjusted my collar. I reached into my secure, fireproof lockbox and pulled out a highly specialized piece of surveillance equipment. It was a military-grade high-definition lapel microphone. I threaded the thin black wire beneath my shirt and secured the tiny audio receiver behind the knot of my dark tie. I synchronized the listening device with my encrypted mobile phone. I tapped the hidden microphone twice to ensure the digital recording application was actively capturing crisp, clear audio. I walked back into the living room and grabbed a heavy black leather briefcase. Inside the briefcase rested a comprehensive investigative file compiled by Oliver's ruthless private security contacts. The thick file detailed the miserable, pathetic reality of Dr. Julian Aris. Dr. Aris was the specific physician whose signature finalized Derek's fraudulent emergency guardianship petition. On paper, he was a highly respected medical professional catering exclusively to the city's elite wealthy class. In reality, he was a desperate, terrified addict completely consumed by catastrophic underground gambling debts. Oliver's aggressive background check revealed that Aris owed massive sums of money to the exact same violent syndicate that currently held Derek's commercial fleet hostage. Derek had not simply found a random corrupt doctor by accident. He had leveraged their shared criminal connections to purchase a medical assassin. Aris was systematically selling illegal high-grade prescriptions and falsifying official medical records just to keep the loan sharks from breaking his hands. He was a weak, compromised man. He was terrified of his own shadow. He was the perfect target for a brutal psychological ambush. I left my house and climbed into my heavy truck. I drove away from the gritty industrial sector and navigated toward the affluent medical district in the center of the city. I parked my rig across the street from a sleek, modern glass building. Dr. Aris operated a premium private practice on the 4th floor. I grabbed my leather briefcase and stepped out into the freezing morning air. I walked through the automatic sliding glass doors and entered the pristine lobby. The air smelled of expensive sterile sanitizers and fresh-cut flowers. I stepped into the polished steel elevator and pressed the button for the 4th floor. I prepared my mind for absolute domination. The elevator doors opened onto a plush waiting room featuring cream-colored leather sofas and soft ambient lighting. A young receptionist sat behind a polished marble counter. She looked up and offered a practiced, welcoming smile. She politely asked if I had a scheduled appointment. I did not break my stride. I walked directly past her desk with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of a freight train. I completely ignored her sudden verbal protests. I projected an aura of absolute, unquestionable authority that paralyzed her in her expensive chair. I reached the heavy, frosted glass door bearing Dr. Aris's name. I grabbed the brushed steel handle and pushed my way forcefully inside. Dr. Aris was sitting behind a massive, clear glass desk. He was a thin, pale man with dark, heavy, nervous circles under his eyes. He wore a crisp white medical coat over a designer silk shirt. He looked up in sudden, absolute shock as I breached his private sanctuary. He opened his mouth to shout a harsh reprimand for the sudden intrusion. I stepped fully into his office and pulled the heavy, solid oak door shut behind me. I reached out and firmly twisted the metal deadbolt. The sharp, mechanical click echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Dr. Aris froze completely. His eyes darted nervously toward the locked door and then back to my face. He recognized me immediately. He recognized the exact man he had legally condemned to a psychiatric ward without ever conducting a single physical examination. I did not say a word. I walked to the leather visitor's chair positioned directly across from his desk and sat down heavily. I placed the black leather briefcase squarely on the glass surface. I popped the brass latches simultaneously. The sharp sound made Aris flinch backward in his expensive ergonomic chair. I opened the lid and pulled out a thick stack of printed investigative documents. I fanned them out methodically across his pristine desk. I ensured every single piece of damning evidence was clearly visible to his terrified eyes. I laid out his private banking statements showing massive unexplained cash withdrawals. I laid out the digital wire transfers originating from known offshore shell companies. I laid out the confidential photographic evidence of his late-night meetings with notorious syndicate enforcers in dark alleyways. I laid out a comprehensive, detailed list of the highly addictive narcotics he had been illegally prescribing to phantom patients to cover his staggering gambling losses. Dr. Aris stared at the papers. His breathing became incredibly rapid and dangerously shallow, the remaining color completely drained from his pale face. He looked like a man watching his entire life evaporate before his eyes. I leaned forward and rested my forearms on the edge of his glass desk. I spoke in a low, terrifyingly calm voice. I made sure every single syllable was perfectly captured by the hidden microphone secured behind my tie. I told Dr. Aris that his lucrative medical career was entirely finished. I told him his pristine medical license was now a worthless piece of scrap paper. I explained that I possessed enough hard, irrefutable evidence to trigger a massive federal investigation into his illegal pharmaceutical distribution ring. I promised him he would spend the next 2 decades rotting inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. I watched the absolute sheer terror completely consume his fragile mind. I did not give him a single chance to formulate a lie. I immediately presented his only viable path to survival. I told him I would permanently bury the investigative file. I told him I would allow him to quietly resign from his prestigious practice and disappear from the city forever. I offered him a very narrow window of total amnesty. But the offer required a steep, immediate price. I demanded a full, unedited verbal confession regarding his corrupt financial arrangement with my nephew. I told him he had to admit exactly what Derek paid him to fabricate the severe dementia diagnosis. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to choose between a quiet, disgraceful exit or a highly publicized federal indictment. I began to slowly count down from 10. Aris completely shattered at the number 7. He threw his trembling hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. He begged me, crying, not to release the medical files to the federal authorities. He leaned frantically across the glass desk. He spoke rapidly, directly toward my chest. He confessed absolutely everything. He admitted that Derek had approached him through a mutual criminal contact in the gambling syndicate. He confessed that Derek handed him $50,000 in untraceable bundled cash inside a dark parking garage. He admitted he had blindly signed the emergency guardianship petition without ever viewing a single genuine medical chart. He confessed he had knowingly condemned a perfectly healthy man to forced institutionalization for a quick, desperate payout. I stared at him with cold, calculated disgust. I had exactly what I needed to destroy Derek's legal standing in any courtroom in the country. I reached out to collect my documents and leave the office. But Aris did not stop talking. The psychological dam had completely broken and the toxic truth was violently spilling out. He grabbed the edge of his glass desk. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated panic. He told me the $50,000 was not just a simple payment for the forged dementia paperwork. He told me Derek had demanded an additional highly specialized service. Aris confessed that Derek had forced him to illegally procure a massive quantity of heavy, untraceable chemical sedatives. Derek had demanded a specific neurotoxin designed to directly mimic the severe neurological symptoms of advanced cognitive decline. Aris admitted with a violently shaking voice that Derek was planning to systematically slip the heavy sedatives directly into my daily food and water. My blood ran entirely cold. The air in the opulent office suddenly felt incredibly thin. Derek was not just trying to steal the commercial fleet through a fraudulent paper scheme. My nephew was actively preparing to chemically lobotomize me. He intended to poison my mind and artificially induce the exact violent paranoia he had described to the armed police officers. He was planning to permanently destroy my brain to validate his forged medical documents and secure his inheritance. The conflict had just violently breached the perimeter of a mere financial dispute. It was no longer simply about protecting the logistics empire from total bankruptcy. Derek was actively preparing a lethal physical strike. I secured the documents inside my briefcase and snapped the brass latches shut. The audio recording was safely uploaded to Oliver's secure cloud server. I stood up and unlocked the heavy oak office door. I walked out of the clinic with the absolute chilling certainty that my nephew needed to be entirely eradicated before he managed to slip poison into my cup. The heavy glass doors of the medical clinic slid shut behind me. I stepped out into the biting winter air. The cold wind hit my face, but it did not rival the absolute ice currently running through my veins. I walked to my truck and climbed inside the cab. I gripped the leather steering wheel. The reality of Dr. Eris's confession settled heavily into my chest. Derek was not simply a greedy heir trying to expedite his inheritance through legal loopholes. He was an active predator preparing to physically destroy my mind. He intended to strip away my cognitive function using heavy chemical sedatives to make his fabricated dementia diagnosis a reality. He wanted to trap me inside my own deteriorating brain. I started the engine and drove back toward the industrial yard. The federal injunction had completely paralyzed their financial mobility. The public humiliation at my front door had entirely shattered their intimidation tactics. Derek and Nicole were entirely out of legal and aggressive options. I knew the psychology of a desperate, cornered animal. When the external avenues of escape are systematically blocked, the animal retreats to its den and prepares a lethal ambush. They needed me incapacitated immediately. The looming Monday deadline with the underground gambling syndicate left them zero room for hesitation. I knew the next strike would not come from an armed police officer or a screaming fit on my porch. It would come disguised as an olive branch. My mobile phone vibrated in my jacket pocket precisely at 4 in the afternoon. The screen displayed Derek's name. I let it ring 3 times to establish a pace of reluctance. I tapped the screen and accepted the call. I did not speak. I simply breathed into the receiver. Derek's voice filtered through the speaker. It was a masterful performance of total defeat. His tone was heavy with manufactured exhaustion and deep sorrow. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He spoke in the quiet, broken voice of a young man who had finally realized the catastrophic magnitude of his own mistakes. He called me Uncle Reuben. He had not used that title with genuine affection in over a decade. He apologized profusely for the morning incident with the police officers. He claimed the overwhelming stress of his father's sudden death and the immense pressure of running the massive logistics empire had completely fractured his judgment. He stated he was drowning in anxiety and acting out of sheer blind panic. He begged for my forgiveness. He pleaded for a chance to heal the massive rift he had caused. He asked me to come to the main estate for a private family dinner that evening. He stated Nicole was preparing my favorite meal. He framed the invitation as a desperate, necessary attempt to reconcile our differences and find a peaceful, operational path forward. I listened to his elaborate performance with absolute chilling clarity. I recognized the lethal manipulation hiding beneath his quiet apologies. The invitation was the final trap. It was the delivery mechanism for the neurotoxins Dr. Eris had provided. Derek needed me inside the isolated mansion. He needed me seated at his table, consuming the poison willingly. I did not betray a single ounce of suspicion. I allowed a long, calculated silence to stretch across the cellular connection. I let out a heavy sigh to simulate a weary old man wanting peace. I told my nephew I would arrive at the estate by 7 o'clock. I ended the call and set the phone on the passenger seat. The game of shadows was entirely over. I was willingly walking directly into the slaughterhouse. I returned to my wooden house on the edge of the yard. I spent the next 2 hours mentally preparing for the confrontation. I checked the military-grade lapel microphone secured beneath my shirt collar. The tiny device was fully charged and actively transmitting a crisp audio signal to Oliver's secure server. Oliver was sitting in his high-rise office monitoring the live feed. He was ready to dispatch federal authorities the absolute second the trap snapped shut. I put on my heavy winter coat and walked out into the freezing dusk. I did not take my truck. I walked the half-mile across the silent industrial yard. I passed the dark rows of commercial trailers and the towering cranes. I walked toward the heavy wrought iron gates of the grand estate. Simon built the sprawling brick mansion as a monument to our shared success. He envisioned a massive gathering place filled with warmth and family legacy. It stood on the high ground overlooking the shipping yard. The towering columns and the sweeping manicured lawns looked majestic and entirely alien against the gritty industrial backdrop. As I walked up the long, winding driveway, the mansion looked completely dark and imposing. The heavy oak front doors were framed by tall, warm lamps. I climbed the stone steps and pressed the brass doorbell. The door swung open almost instantly. Nicole stood in the grand entryway. She wore an elegant, understated evening gown. Her hair was perfectly styled. The furious, screaming harpy from the previous night was entirely gone. She played the role of the gracious, remorseful hostess with terrifying precision. She offered a soft, welcoming smile that absolutely did not reach her cold, calculating eyes. She gently took my heavy coat and hung it in the front closet. She guided me through the massive vaulted hallway toward the formal dining room. The air inside the house smelled of expensive roasted meats and rich, heavy spices. It was a meticulously crafted illusion of domestic harmony. Derek stood near the head of the long, polished mahogany dining table. The room was softly illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier. The table was set with heavy silver cutlery and fine crystal glasses. Derek stepped forward and offered his hand. I looked at his extended hand for a brief moment before taking it. His grip was entirely firm. His palm was perfectly dry. He was holding his nerve. He thanked me quietly for coming. He gestured for me to sit at the opposite end of the table. He intentionally placed me as far away from the kitchen entrance as possible. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair. I observed the precise tactical layout of the room. Nicole glided seamlessly back and forth from the kitchen. She brought out silver platters of roasted vegetables and perfectly seared cuts of meat. She maintained a constant stream of light, meaningless conversation. She asked polite, empty questions about the weather and my health. She never once broke character. Derek poured an expensive vintage red wine into my crystal glass. He spoke softly about his father. He shared carefully selected nostalgic memories designed to lower my defenses. He was attempting to lull me into a false sense of security before delivering the fatal strike. I participated in the charade. I offered brief, polite answers. I ate small, precise bites of the roasted vegetables. I kept my hands entirely steady. I waited for the specific mechanism of the ambush. It arrived 20 minutes into the meal. Nicole stepped out of the kitchen carrying a small silver tray. She walked directly toward my end of the table. She completely bypassed Derek. She placed a specific ornate porcelain bowl directly in front of me. Thick, heavy steam rose from the rich, dark soup. The aroma was incredibly complex. It was heavily spiced and deliberately pungent. The intense spices were obviously chosen to completely mask the bitter chemical taste of the heavy neurotoxic sedatives. Nicole did not return to her seat. She remained standing near my chair. She rested her manicured hands on the edge of the mahogany table. She leaned forward slightly. She told me she had spent the entire afternoon preparing this specific family recipe just for me. She insisted I eat it while it was piping hot. She stared at me with unblinking, eager eyes. Her gaze was entirely predatory. She was physically vibrating with intense anticipation. She needed to witness the consumption. She needed to watch the chemicals take hold of my mind. Derek simultaneously reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He walked down the length of the table and placed the heavy paperwork directly next to my steaming bowl of soup. He set a solid gold pen on top of the pages. The facade of the remorseful nephew instantly evaporated. His voice dropped the soft, nostalgic tone. He adopted a posture of severe, urgent corporate necessity. He claimed the federal injunction had completely paralyzed the company. He stated the entire logistics empire was actively bleeding to death due to the locked accounts. He told me the loan syndicate was threatening immediate violent repossession of the commercial fleet. Derek leaned over the table. He framed his ultimate demand as a desperate plea for mutual salvation. He claimed the documents would temporarily transfer the master executive authority directly into his name. He swore it was the only possible legal maneuver to bypass the federal freeze and satisfy the ruthless creditors. He told me signing the papers was the only way to save Simon's legacy from total immediate bankruptcy. He urged me to eat my soup and sign the papers to save our family. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair. I looked at the heavy stack of fraudulent transfer documents designed to strip away my entire existence. I looked down at the dark, steaming liquid designed to permanently erase my mind. I stared at the poisoned soup and felt the cold iron weight of absolute victory settle into my chest. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair and stared down at the ornate porcelain bowl. The thick, heavy steam rising from the dark liquid carried the pungent scent of roasted spices and masked chemical bitterness. The stack of fraudulent corporate transfer documents rested inches away from my right hand. The solid gold pen lay heavy and waiting on top of the crisp white pages. I lifted my gaze from the poisoned soup and looked directly at my nephew. Derek leaned across the polished mahogany table with an expression of desperate, pleading sincerity. His eyes were wide and swimming with manufactured remorse. He was playing the role of the terrified son begging his uncle to save the family legacy from total ruin. I recognized that exact expression. I had seen that flawless mask of innocent desperation before. The memory hit me with sharp, absolute clarity. I remembered a rainy Tuesday afternoon over 30 years ago. I had walked unannounced into my sister-in-law's kitchen to drop off some shipping manifests for Simon. I found a 15-year-old Derek standing by the kitchen counter. He had his hands buried deep inside his mother's expensive leather purse. I watched him quietly slip several crisp $20 bills into his own pocket. When I stepped forward and confronted him, Derek did not panic. He did not run. He turned around and flashed the exact same trembling, teary-eyed smile he was currently wearing at this dining table. He had begged for my silence. He had sworn through convincing tears that he only took the cash to buy a secret anniversary gift for his father. It was a brilliant, flawless, and entirely chilling lie from a child completely devoid of normal human empathy. I saw the dark, empty void in his soul that afternoon. I chose to remain silent out of misplaced loyalty to my brother. I chose to believe it was a foolish, youthful mistake. I would not make that fatal error again. Derek pushed the solid gold pen an inch closer to my hand. He urged me in a soft, trembling voice to sign the papers immediately. He insisted the banks were waiting for the faxed documents. He told me to eat the hot soup to calm my nerves before making the most important decision of our lives. Nicole remained standing rigidly near my chair. Her manicured fingers gripped the edge of the mahogany table with white-knuckled intensity. Her eyes burned with a dark, predatory anticipation. She was physically vibrating with the absolute need to watch me consume the lethal neurotoxins. She needed to witness my mind shut down so she could reclaim her stolen luxury. They were both waiting for the quiet, submissive old man to accept his manufactured fate. I did not argue with my nephew. I did not hurl accusations or reveal my hidden hand. I decided to give them exactly what they needed. I reached out my right hand slowly. I made a highly calculated show of an old man's declining motor skills. I allowed my fingers to tremble slightly as they hovered over the table. I bypassed the heavy gold pen completely. I reached directly for the large silver soup spoon resting beside the ornate porcelain bowl. Derek let out a sharp, invisible exhale of relief. Nicole leaned in closer to watch the execution. I wrapped my fingers around the handle of the silver spoon. I did not lift it. I shifted my entire body weight in the high-backed leather chair. I violently jerked my right forearm. I swept my heavy wrist forcefully across the polished mahogany surface. I struck the side of the hot porcelain bowl with immense, deliberate, and unstoppable force. The heavy bowl launched off the edge of the long dining table. It crashed violently against the pristine, expensive hardwood floor. The ornate porcelain shattered into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. The thick, dark liquid splattered in a massive, chaotic radius across the polished wood and the edges of a woven silk rug. The sudden, aggressive impact broke the heavy tension in the room like a gunshot. The pungent, bitter aroma of the hidden chemical sedatives instantly flooded the dining room air. The intense heat of the spill amplified the toxic, metallic smell beneath the roasted spices. Nicole completely lost her carefully constructed high society composure. She let out a shrill, furious scream of absolute frustration. Her perfect, lethal execution was entirely ruined. She dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor. She frantically hovered over the shattered porcelain and the spreading dark puddle. She yelled at me with sheer, unadulterated venom. She completely abandoned the facade of the gracious, concerned hostess. She screamed about the ruined antique rug. She cursed my clumsy, stupid hands. She shrieked that I was a useless, senile burden who destroyed everything I touched. Derek stepped backward away from the table, his face twisted in sudden, stark panic because his primary delivery vehicle was completely destroyed. The sharp, violent sound of breaking porcelain echoed down the vast vaulted hallways of the grand estate. The sudden commotion attracted an unintended guest. Nicole's highly pampered designer dog trotted rapidly into the formal dining room. It was a tiny, fragile animal accustomed to eating scraps of premium beef from the family table. The small creature was immediately drawn by the rich, heavy smell of the spiced meat broth soaking into the floorboards. Nicole was entirely too busy screaming insults at my face to notice the dog enter the room. Derek was too busy staring in horror at his ruined plans to intercept the animal. The tiny dog darted quickly under the edge of the heavy mahogany table. It found a thick, concentrated puddle of the spilled dark liquid pooling near a large shard of broken porcelain. The oblivious animal lowered its head and began to eagerly lap up the poisoned soup. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair. I looked down at the floor and watched the small animal consume the broth. I did not warn them. I did not attempt to kick the dog away. They needed absolute, undeniable physical proof of their own monstrous capabilities. I simply watched the digital clock on my mobile phone resting in my pocket. I coldly and clinically counted the seconds. 1 minute passed in chaotic screaming. The dog finished the puddle and licked its chops happily. 2 minutes passed. Nicole finally stopped yelling and noticed the animal sitting near her knees. She reached out to pick up the dog. The small creature suddenly stopped moving entirely. Its back legs locked and began to severely tremble. It let out a sharp, unnatural, high-pitched whine that sliced directly through the heavy air of the dining room. 3 minutes passed. The heavy industrial sedatives designed to chemically lobotomize a grown man violently attacked the small animal's fragile central nervous system. The dog collapsed hard onto its side against the polished hardwood floor. It began to convulse with terrifying, violent physical spasms. Its small limbs thrashed erratically against the wood. Thick white foam instantly erupted from its mouth and bubbled aggressively over its teeth. The animal's eyes rolled completely back into its skull, exposing nothing but stark white tissue. The horrific sudden medical emergency stopped Nicole completely dead. She looked down at her hands and then down at the dying animal. She unleashed a genuine blood-curdling shriek of absolute total terror. She scrambled backward on her hands and knees, frantically pushing herself away from the convulsing creature. She pressed her back hard against the dining room wall and covered her mouth with her trembling hands. Derek stared down at the foaming, twitching animal. The ultimate lethal reality of his purchased chemical weapon was playing out right in front of his eyes. He watched the violent, destructive power of the neurotoxin tear the animal apart. He suddenly realized the massive dose he had ordered Dr. Eris to supply was not merely meant to confuse my mind. It was brutally toxic enough to cause catastrophic physiological failure. He realized the sheer volume of poison in that single bowl would have likely stopped my heart before the night was over. A heavy, suffocating, dead silence fell over the opulent dining room. The manufactured warmth of the family dinner was entirely dead. The only sound left in the massive space was the wet, frantic gasping of the dying dog on the ruined silk rug. Derek's face turned the terrible flat color of dirty chalk. All the blood completely abandoned his hands and his neck. He slowly lifted his gaze from the foaming animal on the floor. He looked directly across the length of the long mahogany table. He met my cold, unblinking eyes. He realized instantly that the spill was not a clumsy accident. He realized that if I had swallowed a single spoonful of that dark liquid, I would be convulsing and dying in this leather chair. He finally realized with absolute horrifying certainty that I knew exactly what was hidden inside the bowl. I placed my hands flat on the arms of the leather chair. I stood up slowly. I moved with deliberate, heavy, unstoppable power. I did not shake. I did not stagger. I towered over the end of the dining table. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. I bypassed the hidden lapel wire transmitting to Oliver's server. I pulled out a sleek metallic recording pen. I reached forward and placed the small digital device squarely on the dry edge of the mahogany table. I set it down directly next to his fraudulent corporate transfer documents. The tiny red indicator light on the pen blinked with a steady, relentless rhythm. It silently confirmed that every single fake apology, every screaming insult, and every panicked reaction had been securely captured. I looked directly into Derek's terrified, hollow eyes. I delivered the final crushing truth. Family does not poison family, Derek. The blinking red indicator light on the metallic recording pen pulsed with the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a ticking time bomb. The tiny crimson flash painted a microscopic reflection across Derek's wide, horrified eyes. He stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake coiled on his dining table. The absolute silence in the grand room was heavier than concrete. The only sound was the final agonizing wheeze of the poisoned animal lying motionless on the ruined silk rug. Derek slowly raised his trembling hands and pressed his palms against his temples. He was entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his failure. He had calculated every legal loophole. He had bribed a prominent medical professional. He had procured a lethal chemical weapon. He had executed his ambush inside the secure walls of his own fortress. Yet he was now standing over a dying dog with his own recorded confession sitting inches away from a stack of worthless transfer documents. The realization completely shattered his fragile, cowardly mind. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. He simply backed away from the table until his spine hit the expensive custom wallpaper. Nicole did not share her husband's terrified paralysis. The initial shock of the dying animal and the sudden exposure of their murderous plot rapidly mutated into something far more volatile. I watched the profound psychological shift happen in real time. Nicole had lived her entire existence inside a protective bubble of absolute unearned privilege. She had been raised in exclusive gated communities and educated in private elite institutions. She fundamentally believed that wealth equated to inherent superiority. She viewed anyone outside her exclusive social stratosphere as entirely expendable resources. She had looked at me, a blue-collar mechanic who spent 40 years turning wrenches and hauling freight as a subhuman peasant. She believed it was her divine right to take Simon's empire. The stark, terrifying reality that an old, uneducated mechanic had systematically outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and utterly destroyed her perfect, luxurious life completely broke her sanity. Her deep-seated prejudice and blinding entitlement violently overrode her remaining self-control. Her breath began to hitch in sharp, ragged gasps. Her hands curled into tight, shaking fists at her sides. She slowly stood up from the floor. She did not look at the dead animal. She did not look at her cowering husband. She locked her furious, bloodshot eyes directly onto my face. The mask of the refined high society hostess peeled away and fell to the floor. Underneath the expensive makeup and the designer gown, she was nothing but a rabid, vicious predator stripped of her fangs. Nicole let out a guttural, primal scream of pure, unadulterated rage. She lunged forward and slammed her hands down onto the polished mahogany table. She violently swept her arms across the expensive surface. She intentionally smashed everything in her path. The heavy crystal wine glasses shattered against the far wall. The fine silver cutlery clattered harshly across the hardwood floor. The serving platters of roasted meat and vegetables flipped into the air and rained down upon the expensive dining chairs. Dark red wine spilled across the crisp white table linens like fresh blood. She was destroying the physical manifestation of her own luxury because she could not accept that it was officially gone. She did not stop at the edge of the table. The destruction only fueled her violent momentum. She charged directly around the corner of the mahogany wood. She closed the physical distance between us in 3 frantic strides. I did not step backward. I planted my heavy boots firmly onto the floorboards and braced my core. Nicole launched herself at my chest. She screamed a torrent of vile, deeply ingrained prejudice directly into my face. She hurled vicious, bigoted slurs regarding my background, my family origins, and my working-class bloodline. She shrieked that I was a filthy, uneducated laborer who had no right to stand inside her magnificent house. She yelled that I belonged in the dirt with the rest of the garbage. Her voice was shrill and completely unhinged. She demanded I pick up the gold pen immediately. She screamed that she would not allow a pathetic, stubborn old man to steal her future. She roared that if I did not sign the corporate transfer papers right this second, she would kill me with her own bare hands. She raised her right arm high into the air and swung her hand forward with maximum desperate velocity. Her palm struck the left side of my face with a sharp, explosive crack. The physical impact was incredibly violent. The sharp edge of her heavy diamond wedding ring sliced a shallow, jagged cut across my cheekbone. A thin line of warm blood instantly welled up from the fresh wound and began to slowly trail down my jawline. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to block her strike. I did not step away to protect myself. I absorbed the full kinetic force of her desperate blow with absolute stoic authority. I stood perfectly still like a massive stone pillar weathering a pathetic storm. I looked down into her wide, frantic eyes. I saw the exact moment her furious adrenaline completely evaporated and was instantly replaced by cold, absolute dread. She realized her physical violence had zero effect. She had struck me with everything she had, and I had not moved a single inch. She was staring at a man who could not be bullied, intimidated, or broken. I simply looked at her with the cold, clinical detachment of a judge delivering a final sentence. The heavy silence returned to the devastated dining room. Nicole stood inches from my chest, panting heavily. Her hand throbbed from the impact against my jaw. Derek remained pressed against the far wall, completely unable to intervene. The blinking red light on the recording pen continued its steady, silent rhythm on the edge of the ruined table. A sudden, massive, concussive boom violently shook the entire front half of the mansion. The sound was incredibly loud and entirely unnatural. It was not the sound of a polite knock or a ringing doorbell. It was the distinct, devastating impact of a heavy steel breaching ram violently obliterating a solid wood doorframe. The grand oak front doors of the estate burst completely open and slammed aggressively against the interior entryway walls. The sound of heavy tactical boots stomping frantically across the marble foyer echoed like rolling thunder throughout the first floor of the house. Derek flinched violently and dropped to his knees. Nicole spun around and stared toward the grand hallway in absolute terror. Oliver Hayes marched purposefully into the ruined dining room. He wore a sharp black suit and a long, dark winter coat. His face was a mask of cold, lethal professionalism. He was not alone. He was immediately flanked by 4 heavily armed tactical police officers. The officers wore thick, dark Kevlar vests and carried specialized heavy-duty equipment. They fanned out instantly and secured the perimeter of the dining room. 2 officers moved rapidly toward Derek and physically pulled him up from the floor. They slammed him forcefully against the wall and pulled his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists filled the room. The 3rd officer stepped directly between me and Nicole. He raised his hand and ordered her to back away immediately. Oliver walked straight toward the edge of the mahogany table. He completely ignored the shattered crystal and the spilled wine. He looked at the dying dog on the floor and then looked up at Nicole's horrified face. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a digital tablet. He tapped the screen once. I reached up with my right hand and slowly adjusted the dark silk tie around my neck. I deliberately shifted the fabric to fully expose the small metallic clip holding it in place. The device was not just a military-grade microphone. I had explicitly requested Oliver procure a highly specialized piece of surveillance technology. The small metallic bar secured to my tie was a state-of-the-art high-definition digital camera lens. It had been actively transmitting a crystal-clear live video feed directly to Oliver's secure server since the moment I stepped onto the front porch. Oliver looked at Nicole with absolute clinical disgust. He informed her that the federal authorities had just watched her physically assault a senior citizen. He told her the police had listened to her explicitly threaten to murder me. He stated that the entire poisoning attempt, Derek's confession of financial ruin, and her unhinged, bigoted rant had been broadcasted in real time to the district attorney's office. The recording pen on the table was merely a redundant backup system. The true lethal weapon had been pinned to my chest the entire night. They were caught in an inescapable high-definition net of their own malicious creation. The freezing morning sun illuminated the towering glass facade of the Logistics Empire headquarters. Derek and Nicole had spent the entire night processing through the local police precinct. They had utilized an exorbitant emergency bail bondsman to secure their temporary release before dawn. They mistakenly believed that escaping a physical holding cell meant they had survived the initial blast. They rushed directly to the corporate headquarters to secure their power. They intended to lock down the executive floors and spin a narrative of a hostile takeover by a mentally unstable uncle. They fundamentally underestimated the absolute legal architecture my brother Simon and I had built decades ago. I did not need to wait for a slow, methodical criminal trial to strip them of their power. I possessed the original master founding documents. I invoked Article 7. It was an obscure, unassailable corporate bylaw Simon and I had drafted specifically to excise severe internal corruption. It granted the primary founder the absolute legal authority to initiate an immediate, unannounced emergency board meeting and bypass all standard judicial delays. I walked through the pristine marble lobby of the corporate headquarters. Oliver Hayes marched in perfect synchronization at my side. He carried a heavy, encrypted digital drive containing the absolute destruction of my nephew. We bypassed the standard security checkpoints and rode the executive elevator directly to the top floor. The massive boardroom was encased in soundproof floor-to-ceiling glass. 7 elite corporate board members sat around the sprawling, polished granite table. They were highly respected industry veterans and conservative financial directors. They looked incredibly confused and deeply anxious regarding the sudden mandatory summons. Derek sat at the absolute head of the table. He wore a fresh designer suit, but his face was an ashen mask of pure exhaustion. Nicole sat rigidly in the chair beside him. She wore dark, oversized sunglasses to hide the severe swelling around her eyes from her hysterical breakdown. Two incredibly expensive defense attorneys sat tightly flanking them. Derek leaned forward and attempted to project an aura of total executive command. He opened his mouth to officially dismiss the meeting as an illegal stunt. I did not let him speak a single syllable. I walked directly to the opposite end of the long granite table. I stood tall and placed my hands flat against the cold stone. I looked at the 7 board members and informed them that they were about to witness the absolute destruction of their current chief executive officer. Oliver Hayes stepped forward and seamlessly linked his encrypted drive into the central corporate multimedia system. The massive digital screen covering the entire back wall of the boardroom instantly flared to life. Oliver did not offer a polite corporate preamble. He executed a flawless, merciless presentation of sheer, undeniable facts. He projected the raw financial forensics first. Massive, complex spreadsheets filled the screen. Oliver used a red digital laser pointer to trace the exact illicit flow of corporate capital. He highlighted over $4 million systematically siphoned from the primary operating accounts. He tracked the stolen funds through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies and dummy logistics contractors. He proved exactly where the money finally landed. The screen displayed the official accounting ledgers of the violent underground gambling syndicate. The board members sat in absolute stunned silence. They stared at the undeniable mathematical proof that their chief executive had actively embezzled millions to cover illegal personal gambling debts. Derek's highly paid defense attorneys immediately began shuffling their papers. They recognized instantly that the financial data was legally bulletproof and entirely indefensible. Oliver did not pause to allow Derek to mount a defense. He immediately transitioned to the audio evidence. The crisp, clear voice of Dr. Julian Aris echoed through the high-fidelity speakers of the boardroom. The board members listened in profound horror as the corrupt physician detailed the $50,000 cash bribe. They heard the exact medical terminology Aris used to describe the heavy neurotoxins Derek had explicitly ordered. They listened to the doctor confess to fabricating the severe dementia diagnosis entirely from scratch under the direct threat of violence from the gambling syndicate. Several board members physically recoiled in their leather chairs. The elderly chairman of the board covered his mouth with a trembling hand. They were no longer looking at a simple corporate embezzler. They were looking at an active predator who had attempted to chemically lobotomize his own family member to secure a corporate throne. Derek slammed his hands violently onto the granite table. He shouted that the audio recording was completely fabricated. He yelled that I was a desperate old man using illegal wiretaps and artificial intelligence to steal his rightful inheritance. He demanded the board members ignore the slander and rely on their history of mutual profit. Oliver completely ignored the frantic outburst. He tapped his digital tablet one final time. The massive wall screen transitioned from static documents to high-definition video. The crystal-clear footage from my tie-clip camera flooded the boardroom. The screen displayed the opulent formal dining room from the previous evening. The board members watched Nicole's complete psychological collapse in terrifying high definition. They saw the shattered crystal and the spilled poisoned soup. They listened to the dying dog wheezing on the floorboards. Then the video captured Nicole lunging directly into the camera lens. The pristine corporate speakers blasted her unhinged, bigoted screaming. The board members heard her hurl vicious racial slurs and horrific classist insults. They watched her heavy diamond ring strike my face with a sharp, violent crack. They heard her explicitly demand a signature under the direct threat of murder. The video ended and the massive screen faded to a stark, absolute black. The profound, heavy silence in the boardroom was suffocating. Nicole sat completely frozen in her chair. She stared straight ahead blindly. Her high society facade was entirely incinerated. She had been publicly exposed as a violent, bigoted monster in front of the most powerful financial directors in the city. Derek's polished executive persona completely disintegrated. The sheer volume of incontrovertible evidence crushed his spirit. He stood up from his chair. His legs trembled so violently he had to grip the edge of the granite table just to remain upright. He frantically looked at the faces of the board members. He begged them for mercy. He stammered uselessly. He wildly claimed the footage was entirely manipulated. He shouted that the dying dog was a staged theatrical trick. He swore he was the victim of a massive coordinated conspiracy. His voice cracked and broke into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. His defense attorneys quietly closed their briefcases and zipped them shut. They stood up and silently walked out of the boardroom without offering a single word of legal counsel. They knew participating in this disaster would permanently destroy their own careers. Derek watched them leave and finally realized he was completely isolated. He did not look like a powerful chief executive. He looked exactly like the terrified teenage thief I had caught stealing from his mother's purse 30 years ago. I did not break my unyielding stare. I raised my voice and projected absolute total command across the long granite table. I formally invoked the Master Executive Override Clause embedded in Article 7. I explicitly called for an immediate binding vote to permanently terminate Derek's employment and strip him of all corporate authority. I also demanded the board officially authorize full cooperation with federal authorities for immediate criminal prosecution regarding the massive embezzlement. The elderly chairman of the board did not hesitate for a single second. He raised his hand high into the air. Every single board member around the granite table instantly followed suit. The vote was absolutely unanimous. Derek was officially stripped of his entire empire in less than 20 minutes. The heavy glass doors at the back of the boardroom suddenly slid open. Oliver had synchronized the termination vote perfectly with the federal authorities. 6 serious men wearing dark suits and federal windbreakers stepped into the room. They were not local tactical police. They were elite federal agents specializing in massive corporate fraud and interstate embezzlement. They walked directly toward the head of the table. They instructed Derek to place his hands behind his back. The absolute finality of the moment completely crushed Derek. The illusion of his power was gone forever. He realized he was not returning to a luxury estate. He was going directly to a federal holding facility. He turned his desperate, terrified gaze toward the woman sitting beside him. He looked at Nicole and begged her for a single word of support or a promise of salvation. The physical transition from the opulent mahogany dining room to the sterile, unforgiving environment of the federal precinct was violently jarring. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed with a relentless mechanical frequency above the holding area. Derek sat slumped on a rigid steel bench bolted directly to the cinderblock wall. His expensive tailored suit was deeply wrinkled and darkly stained with the cold sweat of absolute panic. He was completely broken. He stared blankly at the scuffed linoleum floor as the crushing reality of a lengthy federal prison sentence settled heavily into his chest. He was no longer a powerful corporate executive. He was a terrified prisoner waiting for processing. Nicole sat on a separate steel bench directly across the narrow hallway. She did not share his paralyzing despair. She was rapidly and coldly calculating her immediate survival. Nicole had never viewed her marriage to Derek as a partnership built on mutual affection or shared struggle. She had always treated her relationship with him as a highly lucrative business acquisition. Her deep-seated entitlement and absolute fundamental requirement for premium luxury overrode every other human emotion. She had married a financial pipeline. That pipeline was currently collapsing under the severe weight of federal fraud, corporate embezzlement, and attempted murder charges. She absolutely refused to let his monumental stupidity drag her down into a concrete cell. She smoothed the pristine fabric of her designer gown and made her final, lethal decision. She stood up gracefully and flagged down the nearest armed federal agent. She demanded an immediate private audience with the lead prosecuting attorney. She stated she possessed critical evidence regarding a massive digital financial conspiracy. The federal agent escorted Nicole down a long, sterile corridor and into a small, windowless interrogation room. The lead federal prosecutor sat behind a scarred metal table. He was flanked by 2 veteran financial investigators. Oliver Hayes stood silently in the far corner of the room. His arms were crossed firmly over his chest. He was waiting patiently to watch the predictable, explosive implosion of the criminal alliance. Nicole did not waste time with manufactured tears or hysterical pleas. She instantly deployed a masterful, flawless performance of a terrified and deeply abused spouse. She sat down smoothly and claimed she was a helpless captive inside her own home. She stated that Derek had completely lost his mind under the extreme pressure of his father's sudden death. She swore with unblinking conviction that she had absolutely zero prior knowledge of the massive corporate embezzlement until the federal agents breached the dining room doors. The lead prosecutor stared at her with deep professional skepticism. He coldly reminded her that she had physically assaulted me on camera. He reminded her that she had violently hurled racial slurs and verbally demanded my signature on fraudulent corporate documents under the explicit threat of murder. Nicole smoothly and effortlessly pivoted. She claimed Derek had physically threatened her life just minutes before the dinner began. She insisted she was acting under extreme emotional duress. She claimed she was forced to play the villainous hostess while Derek orchestrated the complex poisoning scheme. She stated she needed an ironclad immunity agreement before she revealed the final piece of the puzzle. She knew her hollow words were entirely insufficient to secure her freedom. She reached carefully into the hidden silk lining of her expensive designer coat. She pulled out a small encrypted digital storage drive. She placed the metallic device squarely in the center of the scarred metal table. She confidently informed the prosecutor that the drive contained Derek's highly classified hidden cryptocurrency ledgers. She explained in meticulous detail that Derek had been systematically converting the stolen corporate funds into untraceable digital assets. He was frantically trying to hide the massive fortune from the violent underground gambling syndicate. She handed over the exact digital security keys required to immediately seize millions of dollars in stolen capital. She traded her husband's absolute destruction for her own legal salvation without a single second of hesitation. The federal prosecutor carefully plugged the encrypted drive into a secure terminal. He reviewed the massive digital ledgers with his investigative team. The evidence was irrefutable and utterly devastating. The transaction logs completed the complex financial puzzle Oliver had methodically constructed. The prosecutor nodded once. He slid an official binding immunity agreement across the metal table. Nicole picked up a pen and signed her name with a perfectly steady hand. She stood up, adjusted her coat, and walked out of the interrogation room. Derek was still sitting on the cold steel bench in the hallway when the heavy wooden door swung open. He looked up. His eyes were wide with desperate, pathetic hope. He expected his wife to tell him she had successfully contacted a high-powered defense team. He expected a united, defiant front against the authorities. Instead, he watched the lead federal prosecutor walk directly toward him, holding the encrypted metallic drive Nicole had just surrendered. Two large federal marshals stepped forward instantly. They grabbed Derek roughly by the shoulders. They forcefully yanked him to his feet and slammed him face first against the cinder block wall. They informed him that his charges had just been massively upgraded to include major digital money laundering and international tax evasion. Derek stopped breathing. He looked at the small drive in the prosecutor's hand. He looked across the hallway at Nicole standing safely behind the line of armed federal agents. The sheer catastrophic reality of her absolute betrayal struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The mask of the terrified victim instantly vanished from his face. Derek erupted into a violent, animalistic fury. He thrashed aggressively against the heavy grip of the federal marshals. He screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice echoed harshly down the long, sterile precinct hallway. He hurled vile, vicious curses at his wife. He screamed that he had committed every single federal crime specifically to fund her endless, insatiable greed. He shrieked that she was the primary architect of the entire poisoning plot. He bellowed that she had purchased the neurotoxins herself. The marshals brutally swept his legs out from under him. They forced him face down onto the cold, hard linoleum floor. They locked heavy steel cuffs tightly around his wrists and dragged him violently away toward the maximum security holding cells. Derek's agonizing, desperate screams faded slowly behind the heavy steel doors. Nicole did not flinch a single time as her husband was violently dragged away into the depths of the precinct. She watched his complete physical and psychological destruction with absolute chilling detachment. She had successfully severed the dead weight, pulling her toward a prison sentence. She smoothed the pristine sleeves of her designer coat and offered the lead federal prosecutor a polite, grateful nod. She turned and walked confidently down the central corridor of the precinct. The heavy sliding glass doors opened smoothly. She stepped out into the crisp, freezing morning air. The winter sun was fully up now. It cast a bright, blinding light across the bustling city streets. Nicole took a deep, satisfied breath. She felt an overwhelming, intoxicating surge of triumphant superiority. She firmly believed she had outmaneuvered the entire federal government, her corrupt, incompetent husband, and the stubborn old mechanic who had tried to ruin her perfect life. Her internal logic was entirely twisted by her deep-seated, impenetrable arrogance. She reasoned that with Derek taking the sole legal fall for the massive embezzlement and the attempted murder, the original corporate structure remained legally ambiguous. She believed she still possessed the physical keys to the grand estate. She still held the legal title of Simon's devoted daughter-in-law. She pulled her heavy coat tightly around her shoulders and walked purposefully toward the busy street corner to hail a private town car. She intended to return straight to the sprawling brick mansion on the hill. She planned to walk through the grand entryway, lock the heavy oak front doors, and instantly activate the advanced perimeter security system. She was going to physically seal herself inside the impenetrable fortress. She was prepared to fight for her luxurious inheritance in a slow, grinding civil court battle. She truly believed the brutal war was finally over. She believed she was the absolute last one standing on the battlefield. She was entirely, completely wrong. Nicole's black private town car glided smoothly up the long, winding asphalt driveway of the grand estate. The crisp winter morning sun cast a bright golden glow over the sweeping manicured lawns and the towering brick columns. She sat in the plush leather back seat and allowed herself a deep, genuine sigh of absolute relief. The intense federal interrogation and the frantic, desperate maneuvering inside the precinct were entirely behind her. She had successfully severed the dead weight of her corrupt, incompetent husband. She had legally guaranteed her own permanent freedom by trading his hidden cryptocurrency ledgers for total immunity. She looked out the tinted window at the sprawling property and felt a massive, intoxicating surge of triumphant ownership. This magnificent fortress was finally hers alone. She intended to immediately change all the access codes. She planned to hire a private tactical security firm to stand guard at the heavy wrought iron gates. She envisioned a pristine future filled with silent, uninterrupted luxury, entirely funded by the liquid assets she assumed would legally default to her as the innocent, victimized spouse. The town car rolled to a gentle stop in front of the massive oak doors. Nicole stepped out into the freezing air and instructed the driver to leave immediately. She did not look back as the heavy vehicle drove away. She turned toward the grand entrance and froze completely. The heavy oak front doors were pushed wide open. The advanced perimeter security alarms were entirely disabled. I sat perfectly still on the wide, sweeping front porch. I occupied a heavy, weathered wooden rocking chair positioned directly next to the main entryway. It was Simon's absolute favorite chair. My brother had purchased it exactly 30 years ago, immediately after securing our very first major commercial logistics contract. He used to sit in this exact spot on quiet Sunday mornings to survey the massive empire we had built from absolutely nothing. The old wood creaked rhythmically beneath my weight as I rocked slowly back and forth. I wore my heavy canvas work jacket and my scuffed leather boots. I did not look like a polished corporate executive or a high society aristocrat. I looked exactly like the blue-collar mechanic Nicole had always deeply despised. I watched her march up the wide stone steps. Her expensive high heels clicked sharply against the masonry. Her face was a twisted mask of sheer, unadulterated outrage. She simply could not comprehend how I had physically breached her absolute sanctuary. Nicole stopped abruptly at the top of the stone steps. She crossed her arms tightly over her designer coat and glared down at me with burning, venomous eyes. She did not bother to mask her absolute hatred. She demanded to know how I had bypassed the main gate security. She shrieked that I was illegally trespassing on her private property. She reached aggressively into her expensive leather handbag and pulled out her mobile phone. She loudly threatened to dial the local police precinct immediately. She promised to have me physically dragged off the estate in handcuffs. She proudly declared that Derek was currently rotting in a maximum security federal holding cell and that she had secured total legal immunity from the prosecutors. She arrogantly assumed her federal protection deal automatically granted her the exclusive keys to the corporate kingdom. She yelled that the logistics empire might be locked in a bitter financial dispute, but this physical house belonged entirely to her. She ordered me to vacate the porch before she ruined the rest of my miserable life. I did not stop rocking the heavy wooden chair. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic, hysterical tone. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my canvas jacket. I pulled out a single thick legal document bound in a heavy blue folder. I stopped rocking and leaned forward. I extended my arm and offered her the paperwork. I calmly instructed her to read the master title deed. Nicole snatched the folder from my hand with a vicious, aggressive swipe. She ripped open the heavy cover and scanned the dense legal text. I watched her arrogant, triumphant smirk completely shatter into 1,000 jagged pieces. I watched her rapidly process the absolute catastrophic reality of her situation. I kept my voice incredibly low and perfectly steady. I explained the exact legal mechanics of the document she was holding in her trembling hands. I told her that Simon had never been blind to her insatiable greed. I explained that my brother had clearly recognized the toxic entitlement festering inside his son and his daughter-in-law. 2 full years ago, Simon had quietly executed a massive structural maneuver to permanently protect his physical legacy. He had completely removed the grand estate and all surrounding properties from his standard personal portfolio. He had legally transferred the absolute ownership of the mansion into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I informed Nicole that Simon had legally designated me as the sole absolute trustee of that specific entity. Derek never possessed a single ounce of legal claim to the estate. Consequently, her marriage to Derek granted her absolutely zero marital rights to the property. She did not own the brick walls. She did not own the manicured lawns. She did not own the roof over her head. She was officially nothing but a temporary uninvited guest standing on my front porch. Nicole's breathing became incredibly rapid and dangerously shallow. She stared at the irrevocable trust documents as if they were written in a foreign, terrifying language. Her hands shook violently. She tried to stammer out a pathetic legal defense. She desperately attempted to cite her marital rights and her federal immunity deal. I cut her off completely. I told her the federal prosecutors only granted her immunity from a prison sentence. They did not grant her a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio she never legally possessed. Her entire existence inside this house was completely terminated. I raised my right hand and pointed a single thick finger past her shoulder directly toward the wide, sweeping front lawn. Nicole slowly turned her head and looked out over the freezing grass. She finally registered the massive flurry of physical activity happening directly behind her. A heavy commercial moving truck was parked on the edge of the circular driveway. A highly efficient crew of 6 professional movers was systematically marching in and out of the side utility doors. They were not packing delicate antique furniture or valuable corporate artwork. They were exclusively carrying out Nicole's personal possessions. I had authorized them to completely clear out her massive walk-in closets and her private dressing rooms. The movers marched down the stone pathways carrying armfuls of expensive designer dresses, premium silk blouses, and imported Italian leather jackets. They did not use protective garment bags or heavy reinforced wardrobe trunks. They ruthlessly tossed the incredibly expensive clothing directly into cheap, flimsy brown cardboard boxes scattered across the damp winter grass. Nicole let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She watched a burly mover carelessly dump an entire rack of her premium luxury handbags into a crushed cardboard container. She watched another worker sweep dozens of designer high heels into a heavy black plastic trash bag. Her entire curated identity was being aggressively erased and unceremoniously dumped onto the lawn like common household garbage. She completely lost her sophisticated composure. She tried to run down the stone steps to physically stop the moving crew from ruining her priceless wardrobe. She yelled for them to drop her belongings instantly. The lead foreman completely ignored her frantic screaming. He looked directly at me for authorization. I gave him a single sharp nod. He continued tossing her silk dresses into the damp cardboard boxes. Nicole spun back around to face me. Her eyes were completely wild and overflowing with absolute desperate panic. The grand illusion of her superior high society life was entirely dead. She was no longer a wealthy aristocrat returning to a protected fortress. She was a newly evicted vagrant watching her stolen luxury get tossed into the dirt. She clutched her leather handbag tightly against her chest. She had absolutely no access to the frozen corporate funds. She had absolutely no access to Derek's seized cryptocurrency accounts. She had no home to sleep in and no transportation to leave the property. The brutal, unforgiving consequences of her infinite greed had finally completely isolated her. I placed my hands firmly on the armrests of Simon's wooden rocking chair. I stood up slowly and towered over her on the top step of the porch. I reached into the back pocket of my worn denim jeans. I pulled out my old battered leather wallet. I flipped it open and extracted a single crisp $20 bill. I stepped forward and completely invaded her personal physical space. Nicole shrank backward against the cold stone railing. Her entire body trembled with sheer, unadulterated defeat. She held her expensive designer handbag slightly open in her defensive posture. I held the crisp $20 bill directly over the opening of her purse. I did not speak with anger or malice. I spoke with the absolute crushing finality of an executioner closing a lethal ledger. I opened my fingers and let the piece of currency flutter down into the dark bottom of her expensive bag. I looked directly into her terrified, completely broken eyes. I told her the cash was exactly enough for a single bus fare entirely out of the county. I instructed her to take her cardboard boxes and walk off my property immediately. I left the sprawling estate behind and drove directly to the primary logistics yard. The massive steel gates swung open, revealing the beating heart of the empire Simon and I had built. I walked straight into the main dispatch hangar and summoned every veteran driver. These were the loyal men and women Derek had actively attempted to terminate to cut operational costs. I stood on the dispatch dock and looked at the tired, anxious faces of my crew. I did not offer empty corporate platitudes. I delivered immediate, undeniable action. I officially reinstated every single pension fund Derek had maliciously slashed. I walked into the upper offices and personally fired every corrupt middle manager Derek had hired to facilitate his complex embezzlement schemes. The corporate accounts were bleeding heavily from the millions Derek had siphoned away. I did not let the company falter for a single day. I wired my own secret personal reserves directly into the operational accounts to completely stabilize the payroll. To prove that the real leadership had finally returned, I grabbed the heavy keys off the dispatch board. I climbed into the cab of the lead freight truck and took the wheel for the first cross-state shipment of the week. The federal justice system moved with ruthless efficiency. The criminal trial concluded incredibly swiftly. The insurmountable mountain of digital evidence, audio recordings, and forensic accounting left absolutely no room for a defense. Derek was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. During the final sentencing, he kept his eyes glued to the defense table and completely refused to look at me. Nicole fared no better in her newfound freedom. Her absolute lack of assets and massive outstanding credit card debts completely destroyed her life. She was left entirely bankrupt, forced to work a grueling minimum-wage retail job just to survive the crushing reality of her own making. I never visited Derek in federal prison. I did not seek out my nephew to gloat over his total destruction or demand a hollow apology. I clearly understood that the absolute greatest victory over a narcissist is total suffocating indifference. My focus remained entirely on honoring the loyalty that had preserved my life. I drove directly back to the county hospice facility the following morning. I walked down the quiet corridors and found Mrs. Gable sitting alone in her small, dimly lit room. She looked up at me with tired, knowing eyes. I did not simply thank her. I immediately transferred her to the facility's premier private suite. I completely prepaid for the highest tier of premium round-the-clock medical care for the absolute remainder of her life. Her desperate, terrified whisper in the hallway had saved my life from a lethal ambush, and I always pay my debts in full. I eventually returned to the grand brick estate on the hill, but I absolutely refused to live inside its opulent walls. The mansion represented a toxic era of unearned privilege that I actively despised. Instead, I legally converted the massive, sprawling structure into a dedicated commercial training facility. I opened the doors exclusively to young, underprivileged men and women fighting to earn their commercial driving licenses and build honest careers. I walked away from the towering brick columns and followed the dirt path back to my modest wooden house on the edge of the property line. The small structure remained exactly as I had left it. I walked into the simple kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of strong, bitter black coffee. I carried my mug out to the wooden porch and sat down in the crisp morning air. I watched the heavy freight trucks roll smoothly out onto the highway in the distance. The air was perfectly clear. The silence was absolute. At 70 years old, I finally knew my life's work was entirely safe. The ultimate revenge is simply living a life completely unburdened by the treacherous people who sought to destroy it. Did you like my story? Let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what you would have done in my place. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like so I can continue bringing you more stories. Thank you for your support, and I will see you in the next one.